I stood on the doorstep, snow clinging to my coat, the warmth from inside spilling out for just a moment before the door stopped halfway. My son's voice cracked through the laughter behind him. "We weren't expecting you for Christmas." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. The gifts in my hands suddenly felt heavier, my breath fogging in the freezing air. Behind him, silhouettes moved. Friends, family, people I didn't recognize. The smell of roast and cinnamon drifted out like a cruel reminder of where I didn't belong. I forced a smile, said something polite I can't even remember, but the truth rang louder than the wind. After raising him, after building his home with my own hands, after 68 years of never missing a Christmas, I was the one left standing in the snow. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The mornings in December had a kind of silence Bob Ellison both craved and dreaded. The kind that let him hear every tick of the clock, every creak of the wooden floors in the small Colorado house he and Claire once filled with laughter. Now it was only him, the hum of the furnace, and the soft rasp of carving knives against pine wood. He worked the blade carefully, shaping a small angel for Sophie. The shavings curled to the floor like pale ribbons, catching in the morning light. The smell of fresh-cut wood still brought comfort. It reminded him of the years he built homes, the years he built a family. He paused to rub his aching wrist, then reached for his phone on the workbench. No new messages. He scrolled up to the thread with Ethan. His last text, "Snow's coming early this year. You folks staying warm?" Had gotten a single reply. "Yeah, busy week. We're good." That was 2 days ago. Bob stared at the screen until it dimmed. Busy. Always busy. He set it back down, exhaling through his nose. Outside, the town was already dressing up for Christmas. Lights twinkled on Main Street. The church put up its nativity scene, and the grocery store window displayed hand-painted snowflakes. The radio said a snowstorm was expected before the weekend. Bob imagined everyone stocking up, families gathering close, everyone except him. He tried to shake off the thought. He wasn't pitiful. He wasn't forgotten. He just wasn't expected. That's all. He reached for the small stack of wrapped presents on the counter. A new winter coat for Lily. She always complained about the cold. A model train kit for Sophie. And for Ethan, a leather-bound notebook with his initials embossed. "So you'll write things down instead of running from them," Bob had murmured while wrapping it. He chuckled softly at his own sentimentality. The phone buzzed suddenly. Martha. "You better not be out driving when this storm hits," her voice warned through the speaker. "Not yet," he said, smiling. "Just finishing up the last ornament." "You know, you could call Ethan first. Make sure they're ready for company." He shook his head, a stubborn smile on his lips. "Family doesn't need invitations, Martha, especially at Christmas." There was a pause, the kind that carried both fondness and worry. "Bob, just promise me you'll take it easy, all right?" "I always do," he said, even though they both knew it wasn't true. After hanging up, Bob walked through the quiet house. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and dust. He stopped at the mantel, where Claire's photo sat in a wooden frame he'd made years ago. Her smile still had that mischievous softness, as if she knew he'd keep talking to her long after she was gone. "Well, sweetheart," he murmured, brushing his thumb across the frame. "Time to see the kids." He carried the gifts out to his old pickup, the cold biting his fingers through the gloves. Snow clouds gathered thick over the mountains, promising trouble. He hesitated only once when he looked back at the small empty porch and the faint glow from the window inside. "Family doesn't need invitations," he said again under his breath, convincing himself more than anyone. As he turned the ignition, the engine coughed to life. The radio played a carol. "I'll be home for Christmas." Bob smiled faintly, steering down the icy road. The town lights faded behind him, and the first flakes began to fall. He didn't see the storm coming, not the one in the sky, nor the one waiting behind his son's front door. The drive up the mountain roads was slower than Bob expected. Snow flurries danced across his windshield, and the wipers squeaked in protest. But inside the cab, the heater hummed, and Christmas music filled the silence. He rehearsed the surprise in his head. Ethan would open the door, stunned but happy. Lily would laugh. Sophie would jump into his arms. The perfect picture. When he finally pulled into the driveway, the Ellison house glowed warm and golden through the storm. Cars lined the curb, more than he expected. Guests, maybe neighbors or friends. His heart swelled a little. Good, he thought, more people to share the joy. He stepped out, carefully balancing the stack of wrapped presents in his arms. The cold bit through his coat as he trudged through the snow to the front porch. Laughter spilled from inside, high, easy laughter that made him smile. He pressed the doorbell, shaking snow from his shoulders. The door opened, and there was Ethan. But instead of the joy Bob imagined, his son froze mid-greeting. The smile that should have appeared never came. His eyes darted past Bob toward the living room, where voices still echoed. "Dad," Ethan said finally, his voice tight. "You're here." "Surprise," Bob said, shifting the gifts in his hands. "Couldn't let Christmas go by without seeing my family." Ethan blinked, then turned slightly toward the hallway. "Lily?" he called, his tone lowered. There was a faint, muffled reply, followed by a quick whisper Bob wasn't supposed to hear. The seconds stretched uncomfortably. Bob forced a grin. "Don't worry, I didn't mean to crash anything. Just thought I'd—" Ethan cut in, voice unsure. "We weren't expecting you for Christmas." The words landed heavier than snow. Bob's smile faltered. The sound of laughter from inside dimmed, as if the house itself realized something had gone wrong. He could hear someone ask, "Who's at the door?" followed by a hush. "Oh, come in, Ethan added quickly, stepping aside, but the invitation felt mechanical, a reflex of manners, not warmth. Bob stepped in. Boots dripping melted snow on the entryway tile. The living room was beautiful, the tree glowing, the scent of cinnamon, and roast turkey thick in the air. People he didn't know were seated with drinks in hand, talking over holiday music. When they saw him, the conversations quieted. Lily appeared from the kitchen, apron dusted with flour. Her eyes widened, her smile too quick, too polite. "Bob, oh, what a surprise." She glanced at Ethan, then back at the guests. "Everyone, this is Ethan's dad." A few people murmured greetings, lifting glasses, the kind of acknowledgement reserved for strangers, not family. Bob set the presents carefully near the tree. "Didn't mean to interrupt anything, just thought I'd stop by, bring a few gifts." His voice came out steadier than he felt. Lily hurried over, taking his coat. No, it's fine. We're just having a small dinner." From the kitchen doorway, Sophie peeked out, her eyes bright with innocence. "Grandpa," she whispered, breaking into a shy smile. For a moment, that alone made the awkward air bearable. Lily motioned toward the long dining table. "We'll squeeze in another chair." She guided him toward the end, near the corner where the light didn't quite reach. Bob sat, tucking his hands in his lap. He watched Ethan resume conversation with guests, the laughter returning but thinner now, forced. Every smile around the table seemed slightly restrained. The warmth of the house pressed on him like a coat that didn't fit anymore. He reached into his pocket, feeling the tiny wooden angel he'd carved earlier that morning. For Sophie, he thought. At least one person here had wanted him to come. Dinner chatter resumed. Shallow and fragmented. Forks clinked. Laughter rose and fell. But for Bob, the sound felt distant, like hearing a party through a wall. He smiled when someone asked about his drive, said the snow wasn't too bad. But beneath the small talk, a quiet ache built in his chest. From across the table, Ethan caught his eye just once. Neither spoke. Outside, the storm thickened, snow pressing hard against the window. Inside, the house that had once been his family's heart grew colder by the minute. And Bob knew, somehow, this dinner would not last long. The clinking of forks and glasses filled the gaps that words couldn't. The table stretched longer than Bob remembered, not just in size, but in the distance between people. Across from him, Ethan was in full storytelling mode, sleeves rolled up, wine glass in hand. "So, we closed 3 deals this quarter," Ethan said, grinning toward his guests. "Real estate's all about timing. You've got to know when to move, when to hold." The men beside him nodded, impressed. One asked a question about market trends, and Ethan launched into another polished monologue. His voice carried, confident and rehearsed. It was a tone Bob recognized, the one his son used when he wanted to sound like someone else. Bob smiled politely, chewing slowly. The turkey was dry. The laughter felt thinner each time Ethan spoke. He glanced at Lily. She was trying too hard to appear calm, her eyes flicking toward him and back to her plate. When Ethan paused for breath, Bob took the chance. "Sounds like business is going well," he said, setting down his fork. "Glad to hear it. I was just checking my bank app the other day. Saw the mortgage payment cleared like usual. Figured maybe you'd taken it over by now." The sound of utensils stopped. The pause was quick but heavy. Lily's hand froze halfway to her glass. Her eyes shot toward Ethan. Across the table, Ethan's expression tightened. "Yeah," he said slowly. "About that." He cleared his throat, forcing a smile toward their guests. "We've got it handled now, Dad. Don't worry about it." The tone, polite but dismissive, landed like a slap. Bob nodded, pretending not to feel it. "That's good to hear," he said quietly, folding his napkin. The conversation stumbled, then restarted somewhere else, a guest quickly changing the subject to skiing or school closures. But the warmth had drained from the room. Bob felt the air shift, Lily avoiding his eyes. Ethan talking faster now, voice slightly too loud, trying to smooth the edges of embarrassment. Beneath the table, Bob's fingers tightened on his knee, an old reflex from years of biting his tongue. He'd bailed that boy out of trouble so many times, car loans, startup dreams, late payments, and never once asked for gratitude. But this time, something in him recoiled. He wasn't angry exactly. It was closer to grief, a slow sinking realization that love and respect didn't always live in the same house. Sophie's small voice broke the tension. "Grandpa?" He looked up. She stood beside his chair, shyly holding out a folded piece of paper. "I made this for you." Her handwriting wobbled across the front. "Merry Christmas, Grandpa Bob." He opened it carefully. Inside was a drawing, the family sitting around the tree, him right in the middle. At the bottom, she'd written in careful block letters, "Glad you came." The words caught in his throat. He blinked quickly, hoping no one noticed. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice rougher than he meant. "It's beautiful." Sophie smiled, then skipped off toward the tree, leaving him clutching the card like a lifeline. Lily watched from across the table, a flicker of guilt passing through her eyes before she looked away. Ethan kept talking, his laughter slightly forced now, his cheeks redder than the wine. Bob slipped the card into his jacket pocket. The paper was warm from her hands. It was the only warmth that felt real tonight. The rest of the meal passed in fragments. Laughter that didn't include him, stories he couldn't follow, glances that said too much. He tried to join in once or twice, but the words dried up before they reached his tongue. By dessert, he was staring at the candle's flame, lost in the dance of light and shadow. For a moment, he thought of Claire, how she used to smooth these family tensions with a single touch on his arm. Now, there was only the flicker of the candle and the weight of unspoken things pressing on his chest. When the plates were cleared, Bob rose quietly to help, but Lily stopped him. "It's fine, really. You sit." Her smile was gentle, but the message underneath was clear. He was a guest now, not family. He sat back down, the sound of laughter swelling again around him, distant and hollow. Outside, snow gathered on the windowsill. Inside, Bob's heart began to understand something he hadn't wanted to admit. This house was warm, yes, but not for him. And somewhere deep inside, a thought began to form, one that would not leave him alone tonight. By 8:30, the guests were pulling on coats and murmuring goodbyes. The smell of coffee and pine lingered in the air, but to Bob, it all felt strangely hollow, like standing in a house staged for sale. Lily insisted he stay the night because of the snow, but Ethan only half-heartedly echoed the offer. Bob smiled and said he'd be fine. "Roads aren't bad yet," he lied. Outside, the air was sharp and silver. Snow had started to fall in soft, lazy flakes, settling on the windshield as he brushed it clean with the edge of his sleeve. Behind him, laughter rose again from the house, muffled by the walls and the distance already forming between them. He stood there for a long moment, gifts lighter in his hands now that most of them had been left behind, except Sophie's card, which he'd tucked safely inside his coat. The truck's headlights cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the empty road ahead. Bob gripped the wheel, shoulders stiff, eyes locked on the yellow lines barely visible under the powder. The radio played low. Silent night. A cruel joke, he thought. He turned it off. A blur of light and memory filled the cab. He saw Ethan at 12, face lit by Christmas tree glow, ripping into presents while Claire filmed from the couch. He remembered the sound of her laughter, that warm, whole sound that could fill a room and calm his storms. "You spoil him, Bobby," she used to tease. "Let him fall sometimes." But he never did. He couldn't. Fathers were supposed to fix things. The snow thickened, turning the world into a tunnel of white. His eyes stung, but not from the cold. Tears blurred the windshield even more than the weather did. He blinked hard, whispering into the quiet, "We weren't expecting you for Christmas." The words echoed. A casual sentence turned blade. He'd built their house, fixed their roof, covered their debts, and somehow he had become an inconvenience, a man without a place at his own family's table. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles pale. "You raised him better than that, Claire," he muttered. "Didn't you?" The snow slowed as he reached the edge of town. Streetlights glowed amber through the flurries, and the familiar sight of his little house appeared, humble, dark, waiting. He parked, engine idling for a moment before cutting it off. The sudden silence was deafening. Inside, the warmth returned, but it felt fragile. The small Christmas tree stood in the corner, lights twinkling unevenly. Beneath it, half hidden under a blanket of tinsel and ribbon, was Claire's photo. The frame tilted slightly, as if she'd been waiting for him to straighten it. He knelt and lifted it carefully. Her eyes met his, kind, knowing, steady. The ache in his chest deepened. "You would have handled tonight better," he said softly. "You always did." He sat down heavily in the armchair, phone glowing on the side table. He picked it up, thumb moving by muscle memory to the banking app. There it was, the familiar transaction scheduled for next week. Ethan Ellison mortgage payment. Autopay confirmed. He stared at the number, at the quiet habit of it. Month after month, no thanks, no conversation. Just obligation, dressed as love. Snow tapped against the window. The wind howled softly, almost like it agreed with him. His thumb hovered over the screen. Pause payment. Simple enough. A single tap could change everything. He took a deep breath. The silence of the room pressed around him, heavy and expectant. Claire's picture sat on the table beside the phone, her smile frozen mid-laughter. "Maybe this is what letting go feels like," he whispered. The screen dimmed, waiting. Outside, the storm gathered strength, wind pushing against the house like a question waiting to be answered. Bob's finger stayed still, trembling just above the button. The storm outside had gathered its full voice, by the time Bob turned off the lamp. Wind whistled against the eaves, the kind of deep, howling sound that rattled the old window panes and carried through the bones of the house. The power flickered once, twice, then steadied, throwing soft golden light across the room where he sat, still staring at his phone screen. The mortgage payment reminder glowed back at him, calm and indifferent. Next transfer in 3 days. He knew the number by heart, the same amount he'd been sending for almost 2 years now, quietly, automatically, as though it were one of the bills that kept his life running. Bob leaned back in his chair, phone resting on his chest, and closed his eyes. Memory came like a film reel, vivid, unavoidable. Ethan at 22, standing in the doorway with that sheepish grin. "Dad, the car loan fell through. I'll pay you back in a month." Ethan at 30, pacing the kitchen after another failed venture. "Just need a bridge loan, something small." Ethan at 35, voice trembling over the phone. "The market turned, Dad. I could lose everything." And every single time, Bob had stepped in, quietly, without lecture, without hesitation. Because that's what fathers did, right? They protected their kids from falling too hard. But tonight, he felt it, the fatigue in his chest, heavy as stone. A love that had turned into something unrecognizable, a kind of exhaustion that no sleep could fix. He turned his head toward the mantel. Claire's photo caught the lamplight, her smile soft but steady, her eyes patient in the way only she had ever been. He reached out, tracing the edge of the frame with one callous thumb. "You'd tell me to stop, wouldn't you?" he said quietly. His voice sounded strange in the empty room. "You'd tell me I've done enough, that maybe this is the lesson he needs." He paused, listening to the wind clawing at the windows. But what if he hates me for it? What if he thinks I'm giving up on him? The silence after that question felt endless. The house creaked, snow hitting the siding in bursts, like soft knocks. Bob sighed, sitting forward. "You always said love had to mean something. Maybe this is what meaning looks like." He lifted the phone again, the screen lighting his face in cold blue. For a moment, his finger hovered over the button, the smallest movement feeling impossibly heavy. Then, with a quiet, resolute exhale, he tapped pause payment. The confirmation message appeared. Auto-pay suspended. It was done. No fanfare. No weight lifting from his shoulders. Just a stillness that settled into the room like snowfall. Steady, soundless, certain. He opened the drawer of the side table and pulled out a worn leather journal, the same one he'd started the year Claire died. He flipped past pages of old prayers, grocery lists, quiet confessions, then found a blank page. He wrote slowly, his handwriting deliberate, careful. Not punishment, just space. Love needs air to breathe. He stared at the words for a long time, then closed the journal gently. Outside, the storm's fury reached its peak, gusts shaking the house as if nature itself were giving its approval. Snow streaked the windows, wind howled down the chimney. For the first time in years, Bob didn't feel the need to fix anything. He didn't reach for his phone again. He didn't check his messages. He simply sat there, listening to the storm carry his decision into the night. When he finally rose and went to bed, the house felt warmer, lighter somehow. The storm outside became a lullaby instead of a threat. As he drifted towards sleep, one thought echoed faintly. Not guilt, not regret, just a quiet certainty. Maybe this was how love was supposed to sound, not in words or money, but in the space left when you finally stop rescuing someone. And for the first time in years, Bob slept through the storm without guilt. 3 quiet weeks passed after the storm. The snow outside had hardened into gray ice, the kind that clung to the gutters and crunched underfoot. Bob's days returned to their quiet rhythm. Coffee at dawn, workshop in the afternoon, dinner alone with the TV humming in the background. It was peaceful in a strange way, like living inside the eye of a storm that hadn't quite finished passing. Then, one Tuesday morning, his phone buzzed across the counter. Ethan. Bob stared at the name for a moment before answering. "Hey, son. Dad, how are you doing?" Ethan's tone was unusually upbeat, almost forced. Bob could hear traffic in the background. His son's city voice, always moving, always multitasking. "I'm fine," Bob said. "How's everything over there?" "Oh, Ethan laughed lightly. "Crazy busy. Closing a big deal next week. I've been meaning to call you sooner." "Glad to hear that," Bob said, smiling faintly. But before he could respond further, he heard a muffled beep in the background, then another, the tone of an incoming call waiting. Ethan went silent for a beat. "Hold on a sec," his son said. "I gotta—" The line clicked, then returned after a pause. Ethan's voice was different now, lower, rushed. "Dad, hey, weird question. The bank just called me. They said last month's mortgage payment didn't go through." Bob felt the shift immediately, that old, familiar tremor in his gut. "Didn't go through?" he repeated evenly. "Yeah," Ethan said, voice tightening. "Maybe some glitch? The auto-pay thing you set up." Bob interrupted softly. "I thought you said you had it handled now." There was silence, the kind that says everything words can't. Finally, Ethan sighed. I did. It's just, timing's been weird with commissions this month. I'll fix it." "I'm sure you will," Bob said calmly. "Dad, look, I'm not—" Ethan's voice tripped over itself, pride and panic colliding mid-sentence. "It's all right," Bob said, his tone steady but firm. "These things happen. You'll figure it out." There was another pause, followed by a strained exhale. Yeah, I will. Thanks, Dad." The line went dead. Bob set the phone down and stared at it. His pulse was steady, but his hands weren't. He picked up the mug beside him and realized it had gone cold. An hour later, the phone rang again. This time, it was Lily. Her name flashed with a photo of Sophie's smiling face, a reminder of everything good still tethering them together. "Bob?" she said softly, skipping any greeting. "I'm sorry to bother you. Ethan's he's panicking a little." "I figured he might be," Bob said. "He didn't want me to call, but the bank left another message. They're threatening late fees and—" She stopped herself, voice catching. "He's scared, Bob. He won't admit it, but he is." Bob leaned against the counter, closing his eyes. "Lily," he said gently, "I told him before, I'm here if he needs advice, not money." "I know," she said quickly. "I understand. You've done more than enough. It's just—" "I know," he interrupted softly. "I know, sweetheart." The line went quiet for a moment, only the faint sound of her breathing. "I'll talk to him," she whispered finally. "I just wanted you to know." "Thank you," Bob said. "And Lily, don't let him drag you down with his pride. Let him face this." She exhaled shakily. "I'll try." When the call ended, Bob stayed where he was, staring out the window at the pale snowfield stretching beyond the yard. The world looked calm, untouched, but inside, the air felt heavy. He rubbed a hand over his face, the ache in his chest returning like an old bruise. He'd done the right thing. He knew it. But knowing didn't make it easier. He walked over to the fireplace, poked at the embers until they flared. The crackle of wood filled the room, a harsh counterpoint to the quiet storm building inside him. His phone buzzed once more, a text from Ethan this time. "We'll figure it out." Bob didn't reply. He slipped the phone into his pocket, fingers trembling just enough to betray what his voice had hidden earlier. He stood there in the flickering light, proud of the boundary he'd drawn, and heartbroken by the silence it left behind. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Slow, deliberate, endless. By mid-January, The snow had settled into a hard, glistening crust across the small Colorado town. It was the kind of winter where everyone's business traveled faster than the plow trucks. The coffee shop near Main Street buzzed with murmurs about who was behind on bills, who was feuding with whom, and before long, Bob Ellison's name started showing up in those whispers. Martha Jacobs was the one who first heard it. She'd been waiting for her usual black coffee at the counter when two church ladies nearby lowered their voices. "Such a shame," one said, shaking her head. "Cutting off your own son? Over money?" Martha stiffened but didn't turn around. The second woman tutted. "You'd think a man like Bob would know better. Ethan's done so much for this town." Martha bit back a comment. She knew better than to feed gossip, but as soon as she left the cafe, she went straight to Bob's workshop. He was out back, hammering pieces of cedar together, sawdust rising in the cold air like powdered snow. His hands were steady, movements precise, but his eyes looked tired. "Morning, Martha," he greeted, not looking up. She crossed her arms, breath fogging in the chill. "You know they're talking, right?" He glanced at her then, brows furrowed. "They?" "Half the congregation. They're saying you froze Ethan out, that you're letting him drown." Bob sighed, setting the hammer down. "People always need a story." "Well," she said, softer now, "they've sure written one for you." He didn't answer, just picked up a small block of wood, sanding it slowly. The rhythmic scrape filled the space between them. Martha stepped closer. "Is it true, Bob? Did you stop helping him?" He nodded once, still sanding. "I did." "Why now?" He looked up, eyes red from lack of sleep, or maybe just from the wind. "Because he said he had it handled, and I decided to believe him." She exhaled, the frost catching in her breath. "People won't understand that." "They don't have to." Martha studied him for a long moment. "You know they'll judge you, though." He gave a weary half-smile. "They already are." That week, the whispers grew louder. At the grocery store, Bob noticed conversations pause when he passed. At the gas station, a man he'd once worked with clapped him on the shoulder and muttered, "Hope you two work it out." Even at church, he could feel the eyes on him, sympathetic, puzzled, quietly condemning. He responded the only way he knew how, by staying busy. His workshop became his refuge. He started building birdhouses, simple, clean designs, one after another. Rows of them lined the walls, as if he was constructing homes for every bit of peace he'd lost. On a cold Thursday afternoon, a knock broke through the sound of his saw. Pastor Grant stood in the doorway, snow dusting his overcoat. "Afternoon, Bob." "Pastor," Bob said, setting down the saw, "if you're here to recruit me for choir again, I'll save you the trouble. Still can't sing worth a damn." Grant smiled faintly. "No recruitment today. Just thought I'd check on you. Folks are concerned." "About me or about Ethan?" "Both," the pastor admitted. He stepped inside, the smell of sawdust and pine filling the small space. "I heard you made a hard decision." Bob wiped his hands on a rag, eyes fixed on the floor. "I just stopped pretending that love and rescue are the same thing." Grant nodded slowly. "Sometimes they're not. Sometimes mercy looks like distance." Bob looked up, unsure if he agreed. "Maybe, but it feels a lot like punishment." "Boundaries are mercy too," the pastor said quietly. "Especially when they hurt." The words hung in the air, heavier than the scent of wood and oil. Grant gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze, then turned to leave. "Be kind to yourself, Bob. It's not easy being the one who changes the pattern." After he left, Bob stood there in the workshop, the stormlight spilling through the window, painting long shadows across the floor. He picked up a half-finished birdhouse, ran his fingers along the edge, and whispered to no one, "Mercy, huh?" The wind outside howled softly in answer, and for the first time, Bob wasn't sure whose side it was on. The envelope looked harmless enough, thin, white, official, one of dozens that came across Ethan Ellison's desk each week. But when he saw the bank's logo stamped in red ink, something in his stomach twisted. He turned it over twice before opening it. Inside, a single line caught his eye first: notice of intent to foreclose. The words seemed to swell on the page, pressing against his chest. He read them again, slower this time, but they didn't change. He'd missed 2 payments, not 1. Late fees added up, interest climbing like frost across glass. For a long moment, Ethan just sat there at his office desk, the sound of his employees' chatter muffled through the wall. His mind spun. Maybe he could shuffle some accounts, delay commissions, borrow against the company truck. Anything but call his father. By the time he got home that evening, the letter was buried at the bottom of his briefcase. Lily was in the kitchen making dinner, the scent of onions and garlic filling the air. Sophie was at the table with colored pencils scattered around her math homework. For a fleeting moment, everything looked perfect, too perfect to break. "Rough day?" Lily asked, glancing up. "Long one," he said, loosening his tie. "Market's unpredictable right now." She smiled faintly. "You'll land on your feet. You always do." He wanted to believe her. That night, after they'd gone to bed, he sat in the glow of his phone, scrolling through bank notifications, credit limits, and the mounting numbers that no longer made sense. He deleted one text draft after another. "Dad, can we talk?" Before finally turning off the screen. He couldn't do it. Not again. By the end of the week, the cracks started to show. He snapped at coworkers, forgot to return client calls, and missed a meeting that cost him a deal. Each failure stacked atop the last like bricks, closing in around him. At home, Lily noticed the distance. "You've been somewhere else lately," she said one night over dinner. "Just work stuff," he muttered, pushing food around his plate. Sophie, seated between them, looked up curiously. "Mom, what's foreclose? I heard Dad say it on the phone." The fork froze halfway to Lily's mouth. "What did you hear, sweetheart?" "Dad said the bank's mad about Grandpa's money." Lily's chair scraped back as she turned to Ethan. "What's she talking about?" Ethan's face went pale. "Nothing. She must have overheard something wrong." "Ethan!" Her voice sharpened, controlled but trembling. "What's going on?" He stood, running a hand through his hair. "It's nothing I can't fix." "You mean it's something you can't admit?" she shot back. "Don't start." "Start?" she said, rising to face him. "You've been hiding something for weeks. You walk around here like everything's fine while our daughter overhears words like foreclosure. You think I don't notice the phone calls? The panic?" He tried to hold her gaze, but his composure cracked. "It's temporary. I'm handling it." "Your pride's costing us, Ethan," she said quietly, the words landing like stones. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Finally, he grabbed his coat. "I'll make a call," he muttered, and stepped into the cold night. He sat in the car, engine off, breath fogging the windshield. His hands shook as he scrolled to his father's number. For a second, he hesitated, remembering their last conversation, that calm, unbending tone that made him feel 12 again. Still, he hit call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Straight to voicemail. Ethan clenched his jaw. "Dad, it's me," he said into the recording. I need to talk to you. It's important. Call me back." He hung up and stared at the dark screen, the reflection of his own face staring back. Proud, desperate, cornered. Snow began to fall again outside, tapping softly against the windshield. He waited 5 minutes, then 10. The phone stayed silent. Somewhere between anger and shame, Ethan threw it onto the passenger seat and gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. For the first time, he wondered if his father's silence wasn't cruelty, but conviction. Still, that didn't make it hurt any less. The storm outside had quieted into a steady whisper, snow falling in long, silent streaks past the window. Bob sat at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, gone cold, staring at a pile of papers he hadn't touched in years. Old mortgage statements, bank notices, scribbled reminders in Claire's handwriting. He'd pulled them out from the drawer where all the hard years were kept, the ones he tried not to look at too closely. He ran a hand over the faded print of one particular document, Ellison Residence, secondary mortgage agreement. He remembered that day like it was yesterday. Ethan standing in this very kitchen, voice tight with panic. "Dad, the deal collapsed. The bank's calling in the note. If I lose this house, I lose everything." Claire had stood near the sink, her hands still wet from dishes, her face calm but troubled. "Ethan," she'd said gently, "you need to find another way." "There isn't another way," he'd snapped, looking not at her but at Bob. "You'd co-sign, right, Dad? Just until I'm back on my feet." Bob remembered the way Claire's eyes had met his then, a silent plea for caution. But he couldn't say no, not to his son. He'd nodded, almost before thinking. And so, he'd done it. He'd walked into that bank and mortgaged the home he and Claire had built together, the one she'd dreamed of retiring in, filled with sunlight and wood and memories. He could still remember the look on her face afterward, the sadness hidden behind her small, tired smile. "You're saving him," she had said, not unkindly, "but you're also teaching him he never has to save himself." He hadn't wanted to believe that then, but sitting there now, surrounded by yellowed paper and regret, he could hear her voice as if she were standing right beside him. He reached for a smaller box on the table, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside were Claire's old letters, tied neatly with a ribbon that had once been red, now faded to a soft rose. He untied it carefully, fingers trembling, and unfolded the top letter. December 24th, 2014. Her handwriting curved in steady loops across the page. "If you're reading this, it probably means something's weighing on you again. You always tried to carry everyone, Bob. Me, Ethan, the world. But love isn't about carrying. It's about standing beside. Sometimes love has to say no, not because it stops caring, but because it's the only way to help someone grow." The words blurred as his eyes filled. He blinked hard, but the tears spilled anyway, dark spots forming on the ink until the lines ran together. He whispered, voice cracking, "You were right, Claire. You were right all along." He leaned back in the chair, the letter still open before him, and let the memories wash through. Every bailout, every just this once. Every moment he'd told himself he was being a good father, when really he'd been avoiding a harder truth. For the first time, he felt something new threading through the guilt, vindication. Not the kind that feels good, but the kind that feels earned, painfully, honestly earned. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, folded the letter gently, and placed it back in the box. Then he opened his journal, the same one where he'd written, not punishment, just space. Tonight, his handwriting was firmer, less shaky. He wrote, "No more rescues without respect." The words sat there like a vow, clean, unflinching, final. He closed the journal and stared out the window. Snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence, hiding everything beneath its quiet mercy. Bob exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the glass. "Tomorrow," he murmured to the night, "I'll talk to him. No lectures, no guilt, just truth." The snow thickened, wind beginning to stir again, as if the world itself were bracing for what would come next. The knock on the door came hard and fast, not the hesitant tap of a visitor, but the kind that carried anger in its rhythm. Bob set down his coffee and opened it to find Ethan standing there, his jaw tight, breath fogging in the cold. Snow clung to his shoulders, melting down into his coat. "Can I come in?" Ethan asked, though it wasn't really a question. Bob stepped aside. The younger man stormed past him, pacing the small living room like a caged thing. His eyes landed on the workshop table, the open journal, the quiet domestic stillness that only seemed to make him angrier. "Got your message," Bob said carefully, closing the door. "Didn't expect you to drive up in this weather." "Yeah, well," Ethan snapped, turning. "The bank doesn't care about weather, Dad." Bob's expression didn't change. "I figured this was about the house." Ethan took a breath, hands balling into fists. "You'd rather see your son homeless?" The words hit like a slap, sharp and ugly in the air. Bob's tone stayed calm, but his voice lowered. "I'd rather see my son responsible." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Responsible? You think this is about responsibility? I've been killing myself trying to keep everything together while you sit up here playing philosopher with your regrets." Bob crossed his arms. "You said you had it handled. I believed you." "Well, maybe you shouldn't have." Ethan's voice rose, breaking on the edge of desperation. "Maybe this is when you're supposed to be a father, when things fall apart." Bob stepped closer. "Being a father doesn't mean cleaning up after you forever. It means letting you face the things you create. I did my part." "That's rich," Ethan spat. "You think writing a few checks made you some kind of saint?" Bob's eyes hardened. "You think those checks didn't cost me? I mortgaged this house to save yours once. Claire warned me it would come to this, and now it has." The mention of his mother froze Ethan mid-step. He turned, face twisting, anger, guilt, grief, all tangled together. "Don't bring Mom into this." "She's already in it," Bob said quietly. "She always was." For a moment, neither spoke. The house filled with the sound of the wind pressing against the windows, the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then Ethan slammed his hand against the back of a chair. "You've got no idea what kind of pressure I'm under. You had your life figured out by my age. A business, a house, a wife. I'm drowning out there, Dad, and you just watch." Bob's voice rose for the first time, sharp and cutting. "You think I had it easy? You think any of this came without sacrifice? Every brick, every nail, every dollar I earned was from bleeding hands, not bailouts." Ethan flinched at the volume, then shot back. "Yeah? And now you're punishing me because I didn't turn out like you?" Bob's hand trembled at his side. "No, son. I'm trying to give you the chance to turn into your own man." The words hung there, heavy between them. Ethan's breathing slowed, but stayed ragged, his chest rising and falling like a man at the end of a fight. The front door opened suddenly, Lily's voice cutting through the tension. "What's going on here?" She looked between them, eyes darting from Ethan's flushed face to Bob's pale one. "I could hear you two from the driveway. Please just stop." "Lily, stay out of it," Ethan muttered. "No," she said firmly. "You both need to stop acting like enemies. You're too alike to see straight." Bob's gaze softened, just enough to see her point. "Maybe she's right," he said quietly. Ethan turned away, rubbing his temples. "I can't talk to you when you're like this." "Then maybe that's the problem," Bob said. The silence stretched again, brittle and unbearable. Finally, Bob grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. "I need air." He stepped outside into the falling snow. The night was still, the flakes catching in the porch light like ash. He took a deep breath, his lungs filling with cold that burned in the best way. Behind him, voices murmured. Lily's trying to calm Ethan. Ethan's still angry but quieter now. Bob looked out across the field, the white stretching into darkness. He whispered, half to himself, "He'll either hate me for this or thank me someday. Maybe both." Inside, a door slammed. Bob didn't turn around. He just stood there under the falling snow, the cold air pressing against his skin, the sound of his son's anger still echoing faintly behind the glass. Unresolved, unhealed. But for the first time, something honest had been said, and there was no taking it back. The week after the argument, Ethan avoided his father's calls, not that Bob had made any. The silence between them had grown into something solid, something that lived in the house like a third presence. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, unopened. He'd shoved them aside when Lily walked in, pretending to scroll through work emails. But the numbers were unavoidable now. The second mortgage notice had arrived, this one colder, more final. Ethan sat at the table long after Lily and Sophie had gone to bed, staring at it under the yellow kitchen light. His reflection in the glass of the window looked older, worn out. He picked up his phone, opened the dealership's website, and stared at the photo of his SUV, gleaming black, spotless, the car he'd once called his reward for surviving another year in real estate. Now, it was a lifeline. 2 days later, he stood at the dealership's back lot, handing over the keys. The manager gave him a polite smile and a check that covered just enough to make the next payment. The transaction was clean, businesslike. But when he stepped outside, the cold air hit harder than he expected. He looked back once, watching the car that had once been his pride disappear into the row of trade-ins. His reflection faded in the glass of the showroom door. A man stripped of the illusions that used to make him feel invincible. When he returned home, Lily met him at the door, eyes soft, but knowing. "Did you do it?" He nodded, setting the folded check on the counter. "Yeah." She exhaled slowly, relief mixed with sadness. "Thank you." "I don't need thanks," he said quickly. "Just let's not tell anyone, all right? Especially my friends." Lily's expression hardened slightly. "Still worried about appearances?" He rubbed a hand over his face. "You wouldn't understand. My reputation—" "Your reputation won't keep the lights on," she said, her voice steady but gentle. He didn't respond, just turned away, pretending to busy himself with the mail. The sound of her footsteps retreating down the hall was the only answer. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house felt quieter without the SUV in the driveway, like even the walls knew something was missing. He thought of his father again, standing on that porch in the snow, his voice steady and final. "I'd rather see my son responsible." For the first time, the words didn't sting. They made sense. The next morning, he woke early to the smell of coffee and the sound of dishes. Lily was dressed in jeans and a sweater, tying her hair back. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I took a part-time job," she said simply. "Local market needs help with inventory. I'll pick up some shifts until we're steady again." Ethan blinked, caught between gratitude and guilt. "You don't have to." "I know," she interrupted softly. "But I want to. We're a team, remember?" He nodded, speechless. When the door closed behind her, he sat there in the silence, the same kind that used to suffocate him. But now it felt different, not empty, just humbling. That evening, Sophie came into his office, holding a drawing. "Dad," she asked, voice small, "why doesn't Grandpa come over anymore?" Ethan looked up from his laptop. "He's just busy, sweetheart." "But he always came before." He swallowed hard. "Sometimes grown-ups just need space." Sophie frowned, unconvinced. "You should say sorry. Grandpa likes when people are honest." He smiled faintly at that, a child's wisdom cutting deeper than any sermon. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. After she went to bed, Ethan sat in the dim light of his office, scrolling through old photos, birthdays, fishing trips, that Christmas morning when Claire was still alive and Bob had built Sophie a dollhouse from scratch. He realized then just how much of his life had been cushioned by his father's quiet sacrifices. The house, the car, the safety net he'd treated like oxygen. Now, without it, he felt exposed, but not broken, just forced to stand on his own legs for the first time. He opened his email, fingers hovering over the keyboard, tempted to write, "Dad, thank you. I get it now." But he didn't. Not yet. He closed the laptop and sat there in the stillness, the sound of the furnace clicking on. Outside, the snow had stopped. The silence felt different tonight, like the beginning of something rather than the end. The February afternoon was quiet enough to hear the snow melting from the roof. Water dripped rhythmically into the gutters, a slow heartbeat in an otherwise still world. Bob was in his workshop, sanding the edge of a wooden frame, when he heard it, the faint crunch of bicycle tires on the slush outside. At first, he thought it was a delivery, maybe Martha stopping by, but then came a smaller sound, a knock, soft, hesitant. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the door. When he opened it, he froze. Standing there, cheeks flushed red from the cold, was Sophie. Her little bike lay tipped on its side behind her, one mitten missing, a backpack slung crookedly over her shoulder. She was clutching a tin wrapped in foil. "Grandpa," she said, a little breathless, "I brought cookies." For a second, Bob couldn't find his voice. "Sophie," he said finally, stepping aside, "what on earth are you doing out here?" "It's freezing." "I biked," she said proudly, brushing snow off her coat. "Mom doesn't know." That part hit him in the chest. Doesn't know. She shook her head, a strand of hair falling across her face. "She was on the phone. I just wanted to see you." Bob looked past her toward the empty road. "You biked all the way from town?" "It's not that far," she said, a little defensive. "And I brought these." She held up the tin. "Mom said we had leftovers from Valentine's Day." Bob sighed, the kind of sigh that hides both worry and gratitude. "Come on, get in here before you turn into an icicle." She smiled, stepping inside. The warmth hit her immediately, and she unzipped her jacket, eyes scanning the room with that unfiltered curiosity only children have. "It smells like sawdust," she said, wrinkling her nose. "That's because it is," Bob said, chuckling. "Sit tight. I'll make us some cocoa." While the milk warmed on the stove, Sophie wandered into the workshop. Her small fingers trailed across the edge of a half-finished birdhouse, the same kind her father used to build as a boy. "Did you make all of these?" she asked, her voice echoing slightly. "Most of them," Bob replied. "Keeps me out of trouble." Sophie grinned. "Grandma would like these." The words stopped him mid-stir. He turned slowly, watching her trace the grain of the wood. "You think so?" She nodded matter-of-factly. "Mom says Grandma liked things that were quiet. These are quiet." Bob smiled faintly, his throat tightening. "She did. She liked quiet things, said they leave room for grace." Sophie tilted her head. "What's grace?" He thought about that for a long second. "It's when something broken still feels whole," he said softly. She seemed to ponder that, nodding like it made sense. Then she opened the cookie tin. "Mom said Dad's scared," she said suddenly. "She didn't mean to tell me, but I heard her." Bob looked up. "Scared?" "Yeah," Sophie said between bites. "She said he's scared of disappointing you." The words landed heavier than she could ever understand. Bob leaned on the counter, staring at the steam rising from the cocoa. "Your dad's got a good heart, Sophie. Just a little too proud to show when it's hurting." She sipped her cocoa, swinging her legs. "Mom says you're both stubborn." That earned a small laugh. "She's not wrong." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sound of the clock ticking, the occasional crack from the fire. Outside, the snow began again, fine as powdered sugar against the window. After a few minutes, Sophie slid off the stool and walked to the window, peering out. "Do you miss them?" "Every day," Bob said. "You should come over," she said simply. "I can ask Mom to invite you." He looked at her, this small bridge between two generations of pride. "That's kind of you," he said, "but some things take time." She frowned. "You don't have to wait forever." The innocence in her voice softened something in him, the part that had been hardened by months of silence and resentment. He looked around the room, the unfinished projects, the quiet corners of a life paused mid-sentence. and suddenly saw it through her eyes. This wasn't an ending. It was a waiting place. He crouched beside her, meeting her gaze. "Thank you for coming today, sweetheart," he said gently. "You reminded me of something important." "What's that?" "That family isn't broken. Sometimes it just takes a breather." She smiled, not fully understanding, but happy to have made him smile back. When it was time for her to leave, Bob wrapped her scarf tighter and walked her to the end of the drive. The snow had slowed again, a soft hush falling over the world. "Don't tell your mom I let you bike alone in this," he said, half joking. She giggled. "I won't, if you promise to visit soon." He watched her pedal off, small and determined, the red of her coat glowing against the white road until it disappeared around the bend. Bob stood there a while longer, the cold biting his cheeks, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. When he finally went back inside, the house felt different, not full, but alive again. The silence no longer sounded lonely. He glanced at Claire's photo on the mantel, and for the first time in months, spoke to it without heaviness. Maybe we're not done after all. The window pane rattled softly in the wind, like the house itself was agreeing. The town's community hall glowed with warm yellow light, spilling onto the snow-covered street. Inside, laughter mingled with the sound of clinking glasses and low conversation. Every February, the town held its winter charity auction, an event meant to raise money for families struggling through the long, cold months. Bob had attended plenty in his younger years, usually fixing wobbly tables or hanging decorations, but this time he wasn't there. Instead, his contribution stood quietly at the back of the room, a handmade oak table, sanded smooth and finished with a natural sheen. No one knew where it had come from. The tag beside it simply read, "Donated by anonymous friend." Martha had delivered it earlier that day, shaking her head when Bob thanked her. "You're not fooling anyone with that anonymous business," she said. "I'm not doing it for anyone to know," he replied. "Just feels right." Now, at the hall, the table drew attention. People ran their hands along the surface, admiring the craftsmanship, the sturdy joints, the subtle pattern carved into the edges. It was the kind of work that spoke without words. Ethan arrived late, adjusting his tie, trying to appear composed. He hadn't wanted to come. The past few months had been humbling enough, but Lily had insisted. "It's good to be seen doing something for others," she'd said. So there he was, smiling politely, shaking hands with people who still thought his business was thriving. Inside, though, he felt hollow. The sale of the SUV had bought him time, but not peace. His father's words, "I'd rather see my son responsible," still echoed louder than any applause in the room. He wandered past the tables of auction items, pretending to browse, gift baskets, quilts, artwork. Then he stopped in front of the oak table. His breath caught. There was something about the craftsmanship, the way the grain was matched along the top, the small inlay pattern on the corners. He knew that style. He'd seen it all his life, in the furniture that filled his childhood home, in the benches his father built for the church. His hand brushed the wood. It was smooth, perfect, and instantly familiar. The auctioneer's voice boomed from the front. "Next item, this beautiful handmade oak table, donated by an anonymous friend. Let's start the bidding at 200. A ripple of interest moved through the crowd. Ethan stayed silent, arms crossed. Across the room, someone raised a paddle, then another. The numbers climbed quickly. The auctioneer's enthusiasm grew with each bid. At one point, someone whispered near Ethan, "You can tell a real craftsman made this. They say whoever built it's been donating anonymously for years." That word, years, hit him like a slow realization unfolding. How many times had his father quietly given, building things for others without taking credit? How many times had he been too self-absorbed to notice? The bidding ended at nearly double the opening price. Applause filled the room as the winner, a local teacher, clapped in delight. The auctioneer lifted the tag. "This one's going home thanks to our anonymous friend." Ethan felt something twist in his chest. Shame, sharp and deep. But underneath it, gratitude. Warm, unfamiliar, unsettling. He slipped outside before anyone could stop him. The night air was cold, biting against his face. Snowflakes drifted through the yellow light spilling from the windows. He leaned against the railing, breathing in hard, his throat tight. Inside, applause and chatter continued, the celebration of community, of generosity. And all he could think of was his father, working alone in that workshop, hands rough, eyes tired, still finding it in himself to give. He took out his phone, thumb hovering over his father's number. The temptation was strong, to call, to apologize, to say, "I saw what you did. I understand now." But he couldn't. Not yet. He wasn't ready to face the reflection of the man he'd been. Instead, he pocketed the phone and looked up at the sky. Snow fell heavier now, coating the ground, muffling sound, softening edges, even the hard ones in his heart. "Anonymous friend," he murmured, half smiling, half breaking. "You never stopped, did you, Dad?" The church bells rang in the distance, signaling the close of the night. Ethan turned toward home, his breath visible in the frozen air, the weight in his chest heavier than before. But this time, it carried a purpose. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about saving face. He was thinking about earning back respect. He walked into the cold until the lights of the hall disappeared behind him. And somewhere deep down, something in him finally began to thaw. It was a Sunday morning in late February when Bob heard the knock on his door. 3 quick taps, then one softer, hesitant one. He opened it, expecting Martha or the mailman. Instead, Lily stood there, bundled in a wool coat, her hair dusted with snow. "Lily?" he said, startled. "Everything all right?" She smiled faintly, though her eyes told a different story. "Can I come in? Just for a minute?" "Of course," Bob said, stepping aside. She slipped off her gloves, rubbing her hands together. "You keep it warm in here," she said, glancing around at the small, tidy living room. The old photographs, the smell of coffee and pine oil. "Heat's cheaper than loneliness," Bob replied with a half smile, motioning for her to sit. Lily laughed softly, sitting down on the couch. "That sounds like something Claire would have said." He froze at the name, then nodded. Yeah, she had a line for everything. A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with things neither quite knew how to start saying. Finally, Lily reached into her purse and pulled out a small tin. "Sophie made cookies again," she said. "Said Grandpa should get the first batch this time." Bob's chest tightened at that. "Tell her thank you. She's got her mother's heart." Lily smiled, setting the tin on the table. "And her father's stubbornness." Bob chuckled. "Can't argue with that." For a moment, they just sat there, the ticking clock filling the space between their breaths. Then Lily leaned forward slightly, her tone softer. "I wanted to thank you, Bob." He looked at her, unsure he'd heard right. "Thank me?" "For everything that happened, for standing firm, for making him face things." Bob blinked. "That's not something I've heard in a while." Lily gave a small, rueful smile. "I didn't see it before. I was so busy trying to keep the peace, I didn't realize I was keeping us stuck. Every time you helped, I was grateful, but also angry." "Angry?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Because I knew it wasn't sustainable. I knew it wasn't fair, to you or to Ethan. But saying that out loud felt like betrayal." Bob studied her face, the honesty there, the exhaustion beneath her calm. "You've been holding it together for a long time, haven't you?" "Too long," she admitted. "But things are shifting now. He's angry, yes, mostly at himself, I think. But he's learning. Slowly." Bob looked down at his hands, thick and scarred from years of work. "He's a good man. Just hasn't learned what it costs to stand on your own 2 feet. Lily reached out, her voice gentle. You taught him that lesson, whether he says it or not. He laughed quietly, though there was no joy in it. You give me too much credit. I didn't teach him. I just stopped saving him. That was the lesson, she said simply. For a long moment, Bob said nothing. The weight of her words sat between them, real and heavy. Then he sighed. I didn't want it to come to this, Lily. I just wanted one Christmas where we could sit around the same table without counting who owed what. I wanted love, not invoices. His voice cracked near the end. He turned away slightly, embarrassed by the sting in his eyes. Lily's expression softened, her own eyes glistening. Claire would have been proud of you. He shook his head. Claire would have fixed it before it got this bad. Maybe, Lily said, but she'd still be proud. You didn't give up. You gave boundaries. He smiled faintly. Boundaries? Never thought I'd hear that word used like a compliment. Lily chuckled, wiping at her eyes. That's what Pastor Grant said, too. He told me once that mercy sometimes looks like distance. Bob nodded slowly, recognizing the echo of his own recent conversation. He's a good man. They shared a quiet moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Bob rose and poured 2 mugs of coffee, setting one in front of her. Claire used to say coffee fixes most things. Maybe not this, but it's a start. Lily lifted the cup, smiling. She was right about most things. For a few minutes, they talked easily. Small stories about Sophie, about town gossip, about the birds returning early this year. The conversation drifted naturally to Claire. Lily spoke softly. I never told you this, but the first time I met her, she scared me a little. She had this way of looking right through you, kind but sharp. Bob chuckled. That was Claire, kind heart, but she saw through excuses like glass. She told me once, Lily continued, that you had the hardest time saying no. She said it was your best and worst quality. He smiled, staring into his mug. She wasn't wrong. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was warm, settled, like 2 people finally breathing the same air after months of tension. When Lily stood to leave, she hesitated by the door. Bob, he'll come around. You've started something in him. It'll just take time. Bob nodded. I'm not going anywhere. As she stepped out into the snow, the air seemed softer somehow. She turned back once, her breath visible in the cold. Thank you, Bob, for not giving up on us. He watched her go, her figure fading down the road until it blurred with the falling snow. Inside, the house felt different, not fuller, but warmer. He glanced at Claire's photo on the mantel and whispered, Looks like your girl's doing all right. The wind outside stirred the chimes on the porch, their sound low and steady, a promise that healing had begun, even if it still had a long way to go. The first day of March arrived with a kind of light Bob hadn't seen in months, warmer, thinner, hopeful. The snow was finally giving up, retreating into rivulets that carved tiny streams along the curb. Birds had started returning, their calls breaking the long silence that winter had wrapped around the house. Bob was in his workshop, planing the edge of a pine board, when his phone buzzed on the workbench. He wiped his hands on his flannel and reached for it, expecting maybe Martha or Lily checking in, but it wasn't either of them. It was from Ethan. No message, just a photo. The image loaded slowly, the signal weak out here in the hills. When it finally appeared, Bob felt his breath catch. It was a receipt, a screenshot from the bank, mortgage payment, paid in full. Below it, a single word, handled. He stared at it for a long time, unable to move. The hum of the heater, the smell of sawdust, the faint drip of melting snow outside. Everything around him seemed to still for that one moment. He read the word again. Handled, simple, short, but heavy with everything that had needed to be said. For the first time in months, he smiled. Not the kind people use to hide behind, but the real kind, the kind that starts in the chest and works its way upward until it softens the eyes. He sat down at his workbench, the phone still in his hand. The last time Ethan had texted him, it had been an argument through silence, calls unanswered, messages ignored. This was different. There was no request attached, no panic, no hidden plea. Just proof. Proof that his son had stood on his own 2 feet. Bob typed slowly, the words deliberate. Proud of you. He read it once, then hit send. No reply came. He didn't need one. The quiet that followed didn't feel cold this time. It was the kind of silence that says enough, the kind that holds peace instead of resentment. He set the phone down and leaned back, staring through the workshop window. The world outside was changing in small, careful ways. The last icicles clung stubbornly to the eaves, dripping rhythmically. Patches of brown grass peeked through the snowbanks. Even the sky looked different, bluer somehow, softer at the edges. Bob thought of Claire then, of the countless winters they'd endured together. He could almost hear her voice, light and teasing. Told you spring would come when it was ready. He smiled at the memory, shaking his head. You were right again, he murmured. That evening, he made himself a fresh pot of coffee and took it out to the porch. The air still held a bite, but it smelled like new beginnings, wet earth, thawing pine, the faint sweetness of sap. Across the valley, the last of the snow was breaking apart, little rivers running through the fields. He checked his phone again, half hoping for a reply, but there was none. Just the quiet glow of the message thread. Handled. Proud of you. 2 simple lines, bridging everything that words had failed to fix before. He took a slow sip of coffee and felt something settle in him, something that had been restless for far too long. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was peace in motion. Down the hill, the runoff from the snow had formed a small stream that caught the evening light, glittering like silver. Bob watched it wind its way toward the road, steady and sure. Spring was coming, and with it, the fragile promise of renewal. He smiled again, not because everything was mended, but because something had begun. And sometimes, he thought, beginning again was enough. It happened just when things were starting to feel steady again, the kind of calm that makes you believe the worst is finally behind you. Ethan had woken early that Monday, the sun slanting across the kitchen table, a mug of coffee warming his hands. For the first time in a long while, he felt in control. The mortgage was paid. The house was safe. His father's silence had turned from punishment to peace. Then came the email. He clicked it without thinking. Subject line, delinquency notice, immediate action required. At first, he thought it had to be a mistake. He'd made the payment. He'd seen it clear his account. But as he read, the words blurred together. Payment not received. Foreclosure proceedings pending. His stomach dropped. He opened his banking app, fingers trembling. The withdrawal was there. The money had left his account. Yet somehow, the mortgage balance still showed overdue. He called the number on the email, navigating through endless hold music until someone finally answered. Yes, sir, the representative said, her voice detached and polite. It appears your payment was misapplied to a closed escrow account. The funds are being held, but the mortgage system still registers delinquent. What does that even mean? He snapped. It means, she replied, until it's corrected, your loan remains in default. By the time he hung up, his pulse was hammering in his ears. He could feel the panic crawling up his throat, that old, familiar helplessness. He'd worked so hard to climb out of the shadow his father's help had created, and now, just as he'd stood on his own, it felt like the ground was crumbling again. He stared at his phone, thumb hovering over Bob's contact. A part of him didn't want to call. The other part, the scared son, still reached for that number in moments like this. The call rang once, twice, and then Bob answered, calm and steady as ever. Dad, Ethan said, voice tight, I just got a foreclosure notice. Again. There was a pause. That can't be right, Bob said evenly. Oh, it's right, Ethan snapped. What did you do? What did I do? Bob repeated, confused. Did you cancel something? Move money around? Because the payment's gone from my account, but the bank says it never hit. Ethan, Bob said, his tone steady but firm, I haven't touched a thing. Don't lie to me, Ethan's voice cracked. Every time I think I've got this, something happens, and it always circles back to you. For a long moment, the line was quiet, except for Ethan's ragged breathing. Then Bob spoke softly. Son, I don't know what's going on, but I promise. This isn't me. We'll figure it out. I don't need you to fix it, Ethan spat, though his voice betrayed how close he was to breaking. I just need the truth. You have it, Bob said. Check your email. I'll send you the proof. 5 minutes later, Ethan saw it. A forwarded copy of the original bank confirmation, time-stamped and clean. His father had indeed stepped back, just like he said he would. The mistake wasn't Bob's, it was the bank's. Shame hit fast. The anger drained from him, leaving only the hollow echo of exhaustion. He texted, I'm sorry. They said it was an error. I'll fix it. But Bob didn't reply right away. Instead, half an hour later, headlights flashed across Ethan's driveway. When the knock came, it was softer than usual, the kind that said, I'm not here to argue. Bob stood there, coat zipped, hat in hand. Let's go sort this out, he said. Ethan hesitated. I can handle it. Bob's gaze held steady. You already did the hard part, son. This is just paperwork. They drove in silence to the bank, snow melting on the windshield. The drive felt longer than it was, the weight of months of pride and misunderstanding sitting heavy between them. Inside, the bank's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The clerk looked nervous as Bob laid the paperwork down, speaking with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime solving problems without shouting. We're not here for a favor, he said. Just a correction. It took less than 20 minutes. A system glitch, they explained. Funds misplaced between accounts. You're good now, the manager assured, printing a corrected statement. Ethan let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Thank you, he said, turning to his father. Bob shook his head. Don't thank me. You handled it. I just drove. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, the snow glistening in soft patches on the cars. They stood there for a moment, both unsure how to bridge the silence. Ethan finally said, I shouldn't have accused you. Bob looked at him, a small, tired smile forming. You were scared. Happens to the best of us. They shared an awkward handshake that turned, almost by accident, into a brief hug. It wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't cold either. As they walked toward their cars, Ethan stopped. You really came all the way down just to stand with me. Bob turned back, his breath fogging in the chill. That's what fathers do, son. We stand, even when we're not fixing. Ethan nodded, words caught somewhere behind the tightness in his throat. As Bob drove off, he glanced once in the rearview mirror, Ethan standing by his car watching him go. The boy who'd once needed saving was now learning how to stand on his own. And though the road home was slick with melting snow, for the first time it felt clear. 2 days after the trip to the bank, the tension between Bob and Ethan had thinned into something fragile, not gone, but changed. The silence between them no longer felt sharp. It felt waiting. That Thursday evening, Bob called. No long preamble, no formality. Just, you free for dinner? Ethan hesitated. Yeah, I guess so. Why? There's a diner halfway between us, Bob said. Figured we could get something that isn't reheated coffee. A pause, then a quiet, almost uncertain, okay. When Ethan pulled into the gravel lot that night, the sky was painted in the soft pinks of late winter dusk. The neon sign for Maggie's diner flickered above the door, buzzing faintly against the wind. Through the window, he saw his father already there, back straight, hands folded on the table, 2 steaming mugs of coffee waiting. Bob looked up when Ethan walked in. "Didn't think you'd come," he said, smiling gently. "Neither did I," Ethan admitted, sliding into the booth across from him. For a few moments, neither spoke. The waitress came by, poured more coffee, took their orders, meatloaf for Bob, burger for Ethan. When she left, Bob cleared his throat. "It's been a while since we just sat down like this." Ethan nodded, eyes fixed on his mug. "Yeah, I guess we forgot how." They sipped in silence, the low hum of the diner filling the spaces between words. The air smelled like fried onions and nostalgia. Finally, Bob said, "You remember when your mother used to drag us here after church? You'd get that banana split that was bigger than your head." Ethan laughed softly. "Yeah, she'd make you share it, but you'd always let me have the cherry." "Didn't care for cherries," Bob said. "Still don't." They both smiled, and for a moment, the years fell away. After their plates arrived, conversation came easier. They talked about Sophie, about Lily's new job, about how the town seemed smaller every year. Then, inevitably, they circled back to Claire. "I keep thinking about her lately," Bob said quietly. "Feels like she's been closer these past few months, like she's been keeping an eye on us." Ethan nodded, his voice softer. "I've been thinking about her too. I read her old journal again." Bob looked up. "You did?" "She wrote about you," Ethan said. "Said you were the kind of man who built everything he touched. Houses, people, a life. Said she worried I didn't understand how lucky I was to have that." Bob's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee. "She was always too generous with her words." "No," Ethan said firmly. "She was right." The honesty in his tone caught Bob off guard. He set the cup down slowly. Ethan stared at the table. "I was jealous of you, Dad. Always have been. You were steady. Everyone saw you as this pillar, the man who could fix anything, solve anything. I spent half my life trying to be that, and the other half trying to prove I didn't need to be." Bob didn't answer right away. His throat felt tight. "You think steadiness comes easy?" he asked finally. "It doesn't. It's heavy, son. It's lonely sometimes. You hold everything up so long. You start believing that if you stop, it'll all fall apart." Ethan looked up, their eyes meeting. "So you were scared too?" Bob gave a slow nod. "Scared of a lot of things, mostly of becoming useless, of watching you build your own life and realizing you didn't need me anymore." The confession hung between them, simple, unguarded, human. Ethan leaned back, letting it sink in. "I never didn't need you, Dad. I just didn't know how to need you without disappointing you." Bob's eyes softened. "You could never disappoint me, frustrate me, sure, but you're my son. That doesn't come with conditions." Ethan gave a small, broken laugh. "Guess we're both pretty bad at saying what we mean." "Runs in the family," Bob said, smiling faintly. The waitress came by to refill their cups, but neither touched their food much after that. They talked until the neon sign buzzed louder against the dark. The conversation shifted, from business and mistakes to fishing trips and Christmas mornings. To the time, Ethan broke the neighbor's window, and Bob covered for him. To Claire's laughter, and the way she could make both men stop mid-argument with just one look. By the time the plates were cleared, something unspoken had settled between them. A truce, maybe even a beginning. When they stepped outside, the air had turned crisp again, the night clear and star-pocked. They stood beside their trucks, the gravel crunching underfoot. Bob broke the silence first. "I'm glad you came, son," Ethan nodded. "I am too." He hesitated, then added, "I know we can't fix everything overnight." "We don't have to," Bob said. "We just stop breaking it." Ethan smiled faintly at that. Breaking the pattern, huh? Exactly, Bob said. They shook hands, and this time it wasn't awkward. It was firm, steady, the grip of two men meeting in the middle at last. As Bob drove home, the diner lights faded behind him, replaced by the quiet rhythm of the road and the faint hum of contentment that hadn't visited him in years. He glanced at the empty passenger seat, where Claire used to sit, and whispered, "We're getting there, love." The stars seemed to shimmer brighter for a moment, as if in agreement. And though there was still distance to cover, tonight felt like the first time in a long time that both men were finally walking toward each other, not away. The attic smelled like dust and cedar, a faint dry scent that carried time in it. Ethan hadn't been up there in years. He'd come looking for a box of old tax papers Lily swore he'd misplaced, but what he found instead was a cardboard box marked Claire's Things. He hesitated before opening it. The handwriting was his mother's, neat, looping, unmistakable. For a long moment, he just stared, tracing the faded ink of her name. Then he lifted the lid. Inside were yellowed photographs, Christmas ornaments wrapped in tissue paper, and a small leather-bound journal. The cover cracked from age. He picked it up, brushing off the dust with his sleeve. The ribbon marker peeked out from halfway through. He sat cross-legged on the attic floor, the single bulb above him flickering as he turned to the first page. June 3rd, 2008. Bob's working late again. Ethan stopped by the house today, full of plans, real estate, big dreams, new car. He reminds me so much of his father at that age, proud, impatient, certain he can build the world from scratch. Ethan smiled faintly, hearing her voice in his head, warm, teasing, always gentle even when she was right. He flipped a few more pages. July 10th, 2010. They argued again. Bob thinks he's helping by paying Ethan's bills, but I see what it's doing. It's building a wall instead of a bridge. They're too alike to see it. One gives too much, the other takes too much, and both are terrified of being seen as weak. Ethan's throat tightened. He read the line again. They're too alike to see it. She'd seen everything before it happened. The push and pull, the unspoken resentment, the years of pride passing between father and son like a bad inheritance. Further down the page, another entry caught his eye. December 25th, 2013. Christmas morning. I watched Bob build a dollhouse for Sophie. Perfect in every detail. He doesn't realize he's building a map for Ethan too. One day, he'll need to learn that building isn't fixing. Love can't be bought, only shared. The words hit harder than he expected. He swallowed, turning the page carefully, his fingers trembling slightly. Then, near the end of the book, a final entry. If I'm not here one day, I hope they'll both remember this. Neither one needs to win. They just need to listen. Love will find its way when silence ends. Ethan closed the journal, pressing it against his chest. His eyes burned, but he didn't wipe them. He sat there for a long time, surrounded by boxes and shadows, listening to the faint creak of the house settling. The same sound he'd heard as a child when his mother would tuck him in downstairs. He pulled out his phone without thinking, thumb hovering over his father's name. For once, he didn't hesitate. The call connected after 2 rings. "Hey, Dad." "Ethan," Bob said, surprised. "Everything all right?" There was a long pause. Ethan's voice came out quieter than he meant. "I found Mom's journal." Bob didn't respond immediately. When he finally did, his voice was careful. "Where?" "In the attic. She wrote about us, about all of this." Another pause. "She always wrote when she didn't know how else to help." Ethan's breath shook. "Dad, she wrote about this fight, about you helping too much, about me taking it for granted. It's like she knew we'd end up right here." Bob gave a small, unsteady laugh, the kind that carries tears behind it. "That woman always saw 2 steps ahead of both of us." "She said we were too alike to see it," Ethan said. Bob exhaled slowly. "She wasn't wrong." There was silence between them. but it wasn't the cold kind anymore. It was full, breathing, alive. "I miss her," Ethan said finally. "Every day," Bob replied. Ethan's voice broke slightly. "She wanted us to stop trying to win, Dad. Just listen." Bob's words came out soft but certain. "Then maybe it's time we do." For the first time, the distance between them didn't feel impossible. It felt navigable, like a road they could walk if they kept talking. Ethan wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, smiling through the tears. "You know what's funny? I think she fixed this without even being here." Bob chuckled, the sound thick with emotion. "Wouldn't surprise me. She was always better at fixing hearts than I was." The two men sat in silence for a long moment, the sound of connection humming between them like an old melody returning to memory. Finally, Ethan said, "I'll bring the journal by tomorrow. You should read it too." Bob's voice cracked just slightly. "I'd like that." When the call ended, Ethan sat there a while longer, the journal resting on his lap. The attic bulb flickered once more, then steadied, a faint golden glow over the worn pages of his mother's handwriting. Healing had begun long before they knew it. Claire had just left them the map, and now, for the first time in years, both father and son were finally following it, together. July brought an early heat that clung to the streets of the small Colorado town, but inside the church hall, it was Christmas again. Garland wrapped the banisters, twinkle lights shimmered across the ceiling, and the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled the air. It was the annual Christmas in July charity dinner, a tradition meant to remind everyone that generosity shouldn't depend on the calendar. Bob stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, stirring gravy in a dented steel pot. He moved slower these days, but there was still precision in his hands, the kind of rhythm built over years of making things that lasted. "Careful," came Ethan's voice from behind. "That gravy's thick enough to stand a spoon in." Bob smirked. "You always did like your sauces runny. That's why you burned the first batch of chili you ever made." Ethan grinned, handing over a tray of rolls. "I was 16. You didn't exactly give me time to read the recipe." "Lesson learned," Bob said, tapping the spoon against the pot. For the first time in years, they sounded like what they used to be. Not perfect, not fixed, but comfortable. The kitchen buzzed around them, volunteers passing trays and calling orders. Every few minutes, someone would glance their way. The father and son who'd once been the subject of whispered church gossip, now standing side by side, working in quiet tandem. At one point, Pastor Grant stepped into the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He took in the scene, Bob at the stove, Ethan ladling mashed potatoes beside him, and smiled. "Well," he said, voice carrying that calm warmth of his, "if anyone needed proof that miracles look ordinary, I'd say we have it right here." Bob chuckled under his breath. "You calling us a miracle, Pastor?" Grant shrugged. "You're both here, working together, feeding people. That counts in my book." Ethan exchanged a glance with his father, both men smiling but saying nothing. By the time the doors opened, the hall was filled with the low murmur of neighbors, families, older folks from the shelter, kids chasing each other between tables. Lily and Sophie sat near the front, helping serve desserts. Sophie wore a Santa hat far too big for her head, giggling each time it slipped over her eyes. Bob brought out the first tray of turkey, while Ethan followed with the potatoes. The sight didn't go unnoticed. 2 generations moving in sync, unspoken harmony in every gesture. "Need a hand, Grandpa?" Sophie called as he passed. "I think I've got it covered," Bob said, grinning. Lily smiled at the exchange, then looked up at Ethan. He caught her gaze and nodded softly. There was something wordless in it, a promise, maybe, or an apology already understood. As the evening wore on, laughter replaced small talk. Music drifted from a small speaker near the tree, slow carols sung half ironically, half sincerely. When the crowd thinned, Bob and Ethan sat down for the first time, sharing what was left of the meal. Remember when Mom used to volunteer for this? Ethan said quietly. Bob nodded. She'd bake 5 pies and still say it wasn't enough. She'd love this, Ethan said, looking around. Yeah, Bob replied, voice soft. She'd say we finally stopped being stubborn long enough to see each other. They both laughed, tired, genuine laughter that seemed to lift something invisible between them. Pastor Grant passed by again, resting a hand briefly on Bob's shoulder. You did good tonight, he said. Bob glanced at Ethan. We did good. The pastor smiled. Then I suppose it's settled, debt paid in full. When the tables were cleared and the last guests had left, Lily and Sophie joined them. Sophie climbed onto Bob's lap, holding a cookie in each hand. Mom says we can go get ice cream after this, she whispered conspiratorially. Bob chuckled. Ice cream after cookies? That's dangerous talk. Ethan leaned back in his chair, looking around the hall, at the empty plates, the fading lights, the family he nearly lost and somehow found again. Feels different now, he said quietly. Bob looked over at him, eyes tired but peaceful. Yeah, he said. That's what happens when things finally even out. Outside, the sun was setting behind the church steeple, streaking the sky with gold. The lights inside glowed softer now, flickering like the last embers of a long, warm fire. The town would forget the details of this dinner soon enough. Who served what? Who spoke last? But for the Ellisons, it was the night the scales balanced. The night the emotional debt that had followed them for years quietly dissolved. And as they walked out together, father, son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter, the door closed gently behind them, leaving the hall empty but full of light. The air was different this time when Bob pulled into the driveway. Not heavy, not hesitant, just calm. The front porch light was on, glowing against the soft dusk. He noticed the details he'd missed before. The new paint on the shutters, the flowers Lily had planted along the walkway, Sophie's bike leaning against the fence. Life was happening here again. Real life. Not the brittle kind they'd been faking for years. When he stepped out of his truck, Ethan was already at the door, holding it open. You found the place all right? He said with a small grin, the same joke his father used to make whenever he visited him. Bob smiled back. Didn't need a map this time. Lily met him in the hallway, warm and genuine. We're really glad you came, Bob. Dinner's almost ready. I can smell it, he said, taking off his coat. Smells like family again. From the living room, Sophie's laughter rang out. She was sprawled on the floor with coloring pencils, humming to herself. When she saw him, she jumped up, running straight into his arms. Grandpa, you came this time when we expected you. He laughed, holding her tight. Yeah, I finally learned to knock first. They all ate together. The conversation light and easy. No careful pauses, no eggshells, just stories, old memories, small jokes, the rhythm of people who had finally stopped keeping score. After dessert, while Lily and Sophie cleared the plates, Bob went out to the truck. When he came back, he was carrying something wrapped in an old flannel cloth. Ethan frowned. What's that? Bob set it on the table, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a small wooden box, rich walnut, the surface carved with the initials B+E intertwined, surrounded by a simple pattern of leaves. It was the kind of craftsmanship that spoke without words, clean, honest, meant to last. Ethan reached out to touch it. You made this? Finished it last week, Bob said. Been working on it since before things got better. Ethan studied it, his voice quiet. It's beautiful. Bob nodded toward it. Go on, open it. Inside the box was a stack of crisp documents, folded neatly. At first, Ethan looked confused. Then he saw the top page, Ellison Family Education Trust. His eyes widened. Dad, what is this? It's a fund, Bob said simply. For Sophie's future, college, trade school, whatever she wants. The deeds under her name. Ethan looked up, stunned. You did this? For her? Bob's expression softened, but his voice stayed firm. For her, yes, not for you, not to bail anyone out, to build something that matters. I thought about how much money I'd poured into mistakes. Yours, mine, all of them. I figured it was time to put it towards something that could grow clean. Ethan swallowed hard. Dad, I don't know what to say. Then just listen, Bob said. This isn't a rescue, it's a seed. For her, you take care of it. You teach her what it means to earn and respect it. That's how this curse ends, the one where we confuse love with debt. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes before he could stop them. You didn't have to. I did, Bob interrupted gently, because I needed to prove to myself that I could give without enabling, that I could love without fixing, and because you, all of you, deserve a clean start. Ethan pressed a hand to his mouth, his voice breaking. You really did change everything. Bob smiled faintly. No, son, we did. For a long moment, they just stood there. Two men who had once been divided by pride and misunderstanding, now bound by something quieter, deeper. The air between them felt fragile, sacred almost, like the hush after a prayer. Ethan reached forward, hesitated, then pulled his father into an embrace. It wasn't graceful, a little stiff, a little awkward, but real, honest. When they stepped back, both men laughed through tears. Guess we're finally learning, Ethan said. About time, Bob replied. From the kitchen doorway, Lily watched them with quiet satisfaction, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Sophie peeked out from behind her, whispering, Mom, are they hugging? Lily smiled. Yeah, sweetie, I think they finally figured it out. Later that night, as Bob was leaving, Ethan walked him out to the truck. The air was cool, crickets singing in the distance. They stood there for a while, neither wanting to break the moment. Thank you, Ethan said softly. Bob placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Don't thank me. Just make sure she knows she's loved, without having to earn it. I will, Ethan promised. As Bob started the truck, Ethan called out, Hey, Dad? Bob leaned out the window. Yeah? Next time. Don't wait for an invitation. Bob grinned. I won't. He drove off into the quiet street, the wooden box's image still glowing in his mind, their initials carved side by side, not above or below, equal, connected. Behind him, the porch light stayed on long after he disappeared down the road, a beacon for something that had taken years to rebuild, family, steady and unbreakable at last. Spring gave way to early summer, and the days stretched longer, the kind of light that lingered even after dinner, casting everything in gold. In that light, Bob's old workshop came back to life. What had once been a quiet retreat, a place for reflection and solitude, was now filled with sound again. The rhythmic hum of saws, the low buzz of sanders, the crackle of old country music from the radio on the shelf. But the biggest change wasn't the noise, it was the company. Ethan stood across the bench from his father, pencil tucked behind his ear, holding blueprints rolled under his arm. So, he said, tapping the plans, if we moved this wall back by 2 feet, we could fit in a display section for finished pieces. Gives us room to show clients options. Bob looked over the lines, nodding slowly. Makes sense, but we'll need to reinforce the beam. You don't move structure without respecting what's holding it up. Ethan smirked. Sounds like something out of your old lecture book. Bob grinned. That's because it's true, in woodwork and life both. The two of them shared a brief laugh before the rhythm of work took over. There was something healing in it, the clatter of tools, the back and forth of voices not raised but steady, easy. It wasn't always perfect. Sometimes Ethan still over-explained, eager to prove himself, And sometimes Bob still caught himself wanting to correct every small thing. But both men caught it sooner now, each learning when to speak and when to step back. By June, they'd finished their first joint project, a complete renovation of the Old Town Library's reading room. Bob handled the structure and repair. Ethan took charge of design and client communication. When they presented it to the town council, the mayor shook their hands. "Fine work," he said. "Feels like the old days again seeing Ellison on a project sign." Bob and Ethan exchanged a glance, quiet pride in their eyes, no boasting, no tension. Later, back in the workshop, Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and said, "You know, Dad, I used to think working with you would mean being told what to do every 5 minutes." Bob chuckled. "You're thinking of the younger me, the one who didn't know how to listen either." Ethan smiled, leaning against the bench. "I guess we both had to learn that." "Learning never stops," Bob said. "That's what makes it worth doing." As the afternoon light faded, Lily showed up with iced tea for both of them. She watched them from the doorway for a moment. The quiet coordination, the small smiles, the silence that spoke of peace instead of pride. When Bob stepped outside to clean off the sawdust from his shirt, she followed him to the porch. "Looks like you two finally found your rhythm," she said. Bob smiled, setting down his cup. "Took us long enough." She nodded. "You saved us, Bob. Not the way you used to, with money or quick fixes. You saved us by letting us struggle, by standing still long enough for him to see himself." Bob looked out toward the field beyond the house, where the grass swayed in the warm breeze. "Funny thing about saving people. Sometimes it means stepping back and letting them find their own footing." Lily's voice softened. "You gave him that chance, and in doing it, you gave us all a second chance too." He turned to her, his eyes glistening faintly. "I just didn't want him to become me. Tired, lonely, too proud to admit when I needed help." She smiled. "He won't. You taught him the hard part. Now he's teaching Sophie the rest." They both looked toward the yard, where Sophie sat on the grass with a paintbrush in her hand and a plank of wood resting across her knees. Her tongue poked from the corner of her mouth in concentration as she worked, red paint bright under the afternoon sun. "What's she up to now?" Bob asked. "Her surprise," Lily said, smiling. A few minutes later, Sophie ran over, her small hands covered in streaks of color. "It's done," she announced proudly. She held up the sign for them to see. The letters were uneven, but the words were clear. Ellison and Son Workshop. Bob felt his throat tighten. Ethan walked up behind her, wiping sweat from his forehead, and when he saw it, he laughed softly. "You've got yourself a marketing department, Dad." Bob reached out, running his hand over the still wet paint. "Looks perfect to me." They hung the sign above the workshop door that evening, just before sunset. The 3 generations stood there together, Lily snapping a photo as Sophie grinned, and Bob rested a hand on Ethan's shoulder. When the last nail was in place, the sign caught the fading light and glowed a deep amber, the color of old wood polished by time. Ethan turned to his father. "You realize this makes it official, right? We're partners now." Bob nodded slowly. "Partners has a nice ring to it." They both stood in silence, watching the sign sway gently in the summer breeze. It wasn't about the business, not really. It was about what it represented. Trust rebuilt, pride tempered, love restored through effort, not words. As evening settled in, Sophie tugged on Bob's sleeve. "Grandpa, can I make another sign for Grandma, so she knows what we did?" He looked down at her, smiling through the ache in his chest. "I think she already knows, sweetheart." The sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the workshop, but the sign above the door glowed like a promise. The Ellison legacy, finally whole again. And for the first time in years, Bob felt no distance between what had been broken and what had been rebuilt. Only the steady, quiet strength of something earned one brick, one nail, one act of faith at a time. The morning light came in soft through the kitchen window, the kind that stretched slowly across the table before touching the pages in front of him. Bob sat with a pen poised above a blank sheet of paper, his reading glasses low on his nose, the smell of fresh coffee filling the quiet house. He hadn't written a real letter in years. Texts, invoices, to-do lists, sure. But a letter? That took thought, reflection, and lately, he'd had more of that than he knew what to do with. He began simply, "Dear Pastor Grant." The words looked heavy, too formal at first. He paused, then continued, his handwriting slow but steady. "You asked me once what I'd learned from all this. The distance, the anger, the coming back around. I've thought about it more than I expected. I used to believe that love meant fixing everything, that being a father meant stepping in before the fall. But love without boundaries. It doesn't breed gratitude, it breeds debt. And debt, even when it's emotional, turns affection into obligation." He leaned back, rubbing his temple. The truth of that sentence sat deep in him, the kind of truth you don't arrive at by reading or preaching, but by losing and slowly rebuilding. He wrote on, "I realized somewhere along the line that I wasn't helping Ethan. I was robbing him of his own victories. Every time I bailed him out, I told him, without meaning to, that I didn't believe he could do it himself. And every time he took the help, he believed it a little more." The clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, spring was already leaning toward summer, the grass high, the air warm. He looked out the window and saw the new workshop sign in the yard, sunlight glinting off the painted words, Ellison and Son. "We've come a long way since that winter," he continued. "It's strange how clear everything becomes in hindsight. I think about those months often. The snow, the silence, the ache that sat in the house like another presence. I remember the sound of tires on icy roads, the echo of, 'We weren't expecting you.' I remember the storm the night I decided to stop paying his bills, and the quiet that came after when I finally learned to let go." He paused, the pen hovering above the page. "But I also remember the warmth that returned later. Not all at once, just little moments, a call, a visit, the sound of laughter returning where it hadn't belonged for years. Love, I learned, doesn't always roar back. Sometimes it hums softly, steady as a heartbeat." He stopped there for a moment, staring at the last sentence. Then he smiled faintly and wrote the closing lines. "If you ever share this lesson in one of your sermons, tell them it came from a stubborn old man who finally learned that control and care aren't the same thing. I didn't fix my family by force. I saved them by learning how to stop trying. Yours, Bob Ellison." He read it twice, the ink drying slowly under the morning light. Then, almost on instinct, he pulled another sheet of paper from the drawer and made a copy by hand. When he finished, he slid the second copy into an envelope addressed simply, Ethan. He hesitated before sealing it. His heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from the strange weight of sending something that mattered. Then he folded it carefully and set it aside for the afternoon mail. A few days later, the envelope came back. Opened, folded once more, with a single line added in handwriting that wasn't his. "I hear you now. E." Bob stared at those words for a long time, his chest tightening. It wasn't a grand declaration, not a dramatic reconciliation, but it was everything he'd hoped for. Acknowledgement, understanding, peace. He folded both pages together, his words and his son's, and slipped them into the back of his old leather Bible, tucking them between the Psalms and the bookmark Claire had left there years ago. When he closed it, his hand lingered on the worn cover. The sun outside caught the edges of the pages, lighting them like gold. He sat back, letting the stillness settle around him. No noise, no need for words. Just the quiet certainty that this time, the silence between father and son wasn't empty anymore. It was full, complete. Finally, it meant something. The day started like any other. Bob was in the workshop early, sunlight cutting through the dusty air in long golden beams. He'd been sanding the edge of a newly built cabinet, the kind of quiet, steady work that always cleared his head. The radio hummed low in the background, some old country tune from the 70s, and outside, birds were busy in the oak trees that lined the yard. He was reaching for a clamp when it happened. The world tilted, the light swam, and a sharp pain shot through the left side of his head. For a second, he thought he'd just stood up too fast. Then the floor rushed up to meet him. When he came to, he was on his back, the smell of sawdust thick in the air. His right hand twitched when he tried to move it. His voice caught when he tried to call out. The radio kept playing like nothing had happened. Hours later, the steady beep of hospital monitors replaced the hum of his workshop. White ceiling, white sheets, the low murmur of nurses moving down the hall. Bob blinked against the harsh light, confusion slowly giving way to awareness. "Dad?" Ethan's voice came from the side of the bed, low, worried, softer than he'd ever heard it. He turned his head and saw his son slumped in the chair, dark circles under his eyes, coffee cup half empty in his hand. "What happened?" Bob croaked. "You fainted in the workshop," Ethan said. "Neighbor found you when you didn't answer the phone. They called me." Bob swallowed, the memory returning in fragments. "Guess I overdid it." Ethan let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sigh. "Yeah, well, you scared the hell out of everyone." A moment later, the doctor came in. Young, kind-eyed, efficient. "Mr. Ellison, you had what we'd call a mild stroke. Nothing severe, but your body's telling you to slow down." Bob frowned. "Slowdown's not in my vocabulary." The doctor smiled. "It's going to have to be. You'll recover just fine as long as you rest. Light activity only for a few weeks. No heavy lifting, no long hours." Ethan shot his father a look that said, "You heard the man." When the doctor left, the silence between them was thick. Then Bob cleared his throat. "You don't have to stay, you know. I'll be fine." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're not getting rid of me that easy." The line made Bob smile weakly. "Didn't think I was." For the next few days, Ethan barely left his father's side. He dozed in the chair, read through the paper, even learned how to work the coffee machine down the hall. Every few hours, Bob would wake and find him still there, jaw set with quiet determination. When Bob was finally discharged, Ethan drove him home. The ride was quiet. No radio, no chatter, just the steady rhythm of the road. As soon as they stepped into the house, Ethan took over. He made dinner, checked Bob's blood pressure, and arranged the pillows on the couch like a man who'd been waiting for years to be useful. Bob tried to protest at first. "I can do that myself." "You don't need to fuss." But Ethan ignored him, moving around the kitchen with the kind of care that left no room for argument. That night, as they ate chicken and rice at the small kitchen table, Bob studied his son. The steady hands, the quiet focus, the way he listened more than he spoke. "Never thought I'd see the day you'd cook for me," Bob said, a teasing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Ethan chuckled. "Guess we're trading roles now." "Guess so." For a while, they ate in companionable silence. Then Bob said softly, "You know, it doesn't feel bad, being taken care of." Ethan looked up, a faint smile in his eyes. "It's not pity, Dad. It's payback for all the years you carried the weight alone." Bob felt something loosen in his chest. Pride, fear, maybe both. He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." The evening passed quietly, the two of them sitting side by side, watching the last of the light fade through the window. The house, which had once felt too big for one man, now felt just right, filled not with noise, but with balance. When Ethan left for the night, promising to check in first thing in the morning, Bob sat for a long time by the window. The stars shimmered faintly above the dark trees. His hand trembled just slightly as he lifted his cup of tea, but he didn't mind. For the first time, He didn't feel like he was losing strength. He felt like he was finally learning how to rest, how to let love return in its own quiet way. He smiled to himself, whispering, "Not getting rid of me that easy," before leaning back and letting the night settle gently around him. The first snow came early that year, soft, quiet, the kind that turned the world into something gentler. By the time December rolled around, the town of Pine Ridge looked like it had been wrapped in memory. Roofs wore white caps, wreaths hung from every lamppost, and the church bells chimed with a sound that seemed to echo straight from years past. Bob Ellison woke to the faint smell of pine and cold air leaking through the window frame. He sat at his kitchen table, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the flakes drift lazily down outside. Another December, another year older. But this one felt different. Not heavy like the last few, not lonely, just settled. The mail slid through the slot with a quiet thud. He shuffled over and bent down, the joints in his knees reminding him of their age. Among the envelopes and catalogs was one that stood out. Thick cardstock, green and gold lettering. His name, written in Ethan's neat handwriting. He tore it open carefully. Inside was a Christmas card, elegant but simple, and when he read the words, he let out a laugh so sudden it startled him. "We're expecting you for Christmas." He read it again, the corners of his mouth pulling upward. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. The same phrase that had once cut so deep. "We weren't expecting you for Christmas," now turned on its head, like life itself had decided to set things right in perfect symmetry. He held the card for a long time, letting the memory play behind his eyes. The door that once didn't open, the cold drive home, the silence that used to fill the house. And now, this, a full circle written in 6 words. He got up, pulled on his flannel jacket, and walked out to the workshop. The smell of sawdust and cedar still greeted him like an old friend. On the bench sat a fresh block of maple, smooth and pale, waiting for purpose. Bob ran a hand over it thoughtfully. "A star," he said quietly to himself. "Needs a star." He set to work, carving carefully, the blade whispering through wood. Each stroke felt meditative, deliberate, patient. It wasn't just a decoration, it was a message, a symbol, the piece of himself he still had to give. By the time evening came, the star was finished, simple but beautiful, with a small engraving on the back. For Sophie, for new beginnings. He wiped the dust from his hands, polished the surface with beeswax, and held it up to the light. It caught the glow just right, warm and steady. The next morning, he loaded the star into a small box, wrapped it in brown paper, and tucked the invitation card into his coat pocket. As he stepped outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting down from a sky the color of pewter. His old truck coughed once before starting, the engine grumbling like an old friend shaking off a nap. The road was lined with pine trees heavy with snow, the kind that bent just enough to make an archway of winter. Halfway down the hill, he caught sight of the Ellison house. Lights strung neatly along the porch, smoke curling from the chimney, and the faint outline of Sophie dancing near the window. When he pulled into the drive, the front door opened before he even turned off the engine. Ethan stepped out, bundled in a coat, a wide grin on his face. "You got the card?" he called over the crunch of snow. Bob climbed out, holding up the envelope. "You didn't think I'd miss a chance to make fun of your handwriting, did you?" Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "Come on, old man. Dinner's waiting." Inside, the warmth hit immediately. The smell of roasted ham, cinnamon, pine needles. Lily was setting the table. Sophie was hanging ornaments on the lower branches of the tree, and the whole house glowed with that familiar, almost sacred warmth of a family finally at peace with itself. Bob handed the small box to Sophie. "For the top of the tree," he said. She tore it open and gasped. "You made this?" "Just for you," he said. Every tree needs a star. Ethan watched, eyes shining, as Sophie climbed the step stool and carefully placed it on top. The light from the fireplace flickered against the carved wood, making it gleam. Bob felt something tighten in his chest. Not pain this time, just fullness. Ethan moved closer, his voice low. "You know," he said, "I was worried you'd never come back through that door." Bob looked around at them, his son, his daughter-in-law, his granddaughter, and smiled softly. "You didn't have to worry," he said. "You left the light on." Outside, the snow fell heavier now, but the windows glowed brighter against the dark. Dinner laughter spilled into the quiet night, carried away on the wind like a hymn. And as Bob sat at that table, the same table where years of silence had once lived, he realized something simple and profound. Some circles don't close in anger or apology. They close in peace. The world beyond the window was still, blanketed in white, the kind of quiet that feels eternal. And for the first time in years, Bob wasn't waiting for warmth to return. He was sitting right in the middle of it, home, expected, forgiven, whole. The table wasn't extravagant. No crystal, no silver-plated dishes, no fancy linens. Just a simple red cloth, a few candles flickering in glass jars, and the smell of roasted ham and baked bread filling the house. The kind of meal that spoke less about wealth and more about love, quietly repaired. Bob sat at one end, his old hands resting on the table's edge. Across from him sat Ethan, relaxed in a way Bob hadn't seen in years. Lily moved between the kitchen and the table with that calm grace that came only when she was truly at peace, and Sophie, in a bright green sweater, was humming to herself as she arranged napkins shaped like stars. The fireplace crackled behind them, the light painting everything in gold. Outside, the snow fell steady, slow, deliberate, endless. Inside, warmth had finally taken root. When everyone sat down, Ethan cleared his throat. "Before we eat," he said, "I'd like to say something." Bob looked up, surprised. Ethan wasn't one for speeches, not anymore. The room fell quiet, even the fire seeming to hush. Ethan took a slow breath. "This year, this meal, means more than I can put into words. For a long time, I thought I needed to prove something. That being strong meant never asking for help, never admitting I was wrong." He paused, glancing toward his father. "But strength looks different when you grow up. Sometimes it looks like listening. Sometimes it looks like forgiveness. And sometimes," his voice wavered slightly, "sometimes it looks like the man who never stopped showing up, even when we didn't deserve it." Lily reached for his hand, eyes glistening. Ethan smiled faintly and bowed his head. "So tonight, before we eat, I just want to thank God for second chances, and thank my dad for teaching me what real love looks like." Bob's chest tightened. The words landed heavier than any gift could. He swallowed hard, trying to find something to say, but nothing came. He didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Sophie broke it first, her voice bright and sweet. "Can we hang Grandpa's star now?" Ethan nodded. "Go ahead, sweetheart." She hopped down from her chair, ran to the tree, and carefully lifted the wooden star from its box. The family watched as she climbed the step stool and placed it gently on top. The star caught the firelight immediately, glowing warm and golden, almost alive. For a moment, no one moved. The reflection of it shimmered in the window, one bright shape against the dark outside. Lily wiped her eyes, laughing softly. "You've outdone us all this year, Bob." He smiled, his voice quiet. "Didn't do much, just carved what I already had." Ethan looked over at him, meeting his eyes. "That's the point, isn't it?" The meal began. Laughter between bites, stories overlapping, no one talking over anyone else. Sophie told knock-knock jokes that made no sense but made everyone laugh anyway. Lily teased Ethan about his cooking, and Ethan returned it with mock indignation. Bob mostly listened, soaking it in, The sound of family working again like a well-built house, every piece in place. At one point, as plates emptied and candles burned low, Bob looked around the table, the faces, the light, the calm, and realized something quietly profound. Forgiveness hadn't happened tonight. It had been there all along, growing in the spaces between anger and love, waiting for them to finally notice. He leaned back, feeling the warmth of the fire against his back, the faint hum of contentment filling the room. The flames danced higher, throwing shadows across the ceiling, glowing brighter than he'd ever seen them. For a moment, he thought of Claire, her laughter, her steady hand on his arm during every Christmas prayer. He could almost hear her voice now whispering, "You did it, Bob. You brought them home." He smiled faintly, lifting his glass toward the star on the tree. "Merry Christmas," he murmured, mostly to himself. And as the fire popped and the family's laughter carried softly into the night, the house felt alive, not just warm, but full. A circle, finally closed. The sound of hammers and laughter blended inside the workshop, a melody of creation and renewal. What had once been Bob's private refuge had turned into something far more alive. The Ellison & Son workshop was no longer just a name on a hand-painted sign. It was a living, breathing place of purpose. Ethan moved easily among the benches now, showing a group of local high school kids how to square a joint properly. "You can't rush good work," he told them, his voice calm but confident. "Wood remembers every mistake. It's patient, but not forgiving." They listened, nodding, sanding carefully at their pieces. Watching from his usual chair near the window, Bob smiled. Ethan's tone carried traces of his own, the steadiness, the quiet authority, but softened with patience that had once eluded him. He shifted slightly, cane propped against his leg, coffee mug balanced on the armrest. The faint scent of sawdust mixed with pine and varnish, a smell that, to Bob, always meant home. "Don't forget your safety glasses," he called out. "Yes, sir," one of the teens answered. Bob chuckled. "Didn't think I'd hear that again." Ethan grinned from across the room. "Guess they know who's really in charge." "Just keeping you honest," Bob said. The afternoon light streamed in through the wide windows, catching on the floating dust. Outside, the town's main street bustled with people coming in and out of the small businesses, and every now and then someone would pause at the window to watch the father and son working side by side. The Ellisons had become something of a local story, not just for their craftsmanship, but for what they represented. People whispered about it with a kind of reverent warmth, how they'd fallen apart and somehow found their way back. That evening, Sophie came running in from school, her backpack bouncing. "Grandpa," she called, "Mom said I could help today." Bob gestured toward a small table near the corner. "Got your paints ready over there?" She unzipped her bag and pulled out a sketch, block letters surrounded by a painted border of leaves. "It's for a new sign," she said proudly, "for the front wall." "What's it say?" Ethan asked, leaning over her shoulder. Sophie turned the paper around. The words were bright, uneven, but full of heart, built on lessons. Ethan laughed softly. "That's perfect." Bob's smile deepened, though his eyes glistened faintly. "Couldn't have said it better myself." For the next hour, Sophie painted while the men cleaned up the workshop. Occasionally, she'd ask for advice, how to mix the right shade of gold, how to make the letters stand out. And both Ethan and Bob gave their input like equals. When she finally stepped back, the finished sign gleamed in the fading light. The phrase caught on the air like a blessing. That was the moment Martha Jacobs stepped through the open door, bundled in her usual knitted scarf, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Well," she said, smiling, "if this isn't a sight for sore eyes." Bob's face lit up. "Martha, haven't seen you since the charity dinner." "I heard the workshop's booming," she said, looking around. "Had to come see for myself." Ethan wiped his hands and offered her a seat. "We're keeping busy," he said. "Guess the town likes what we're doing." They like who you're becoming, she said, her eyes soft as she looked from father to son. Bob nodded, his voice low. You always said boundaries weren't walls. They were bridges waiting to be built. Took me a lifetime to understand that. Martha smiled. Took both of you, but you got there. Bob leaned back in his chair, hands folded loosely in his lap. Thank you, he said quietly, for believing in us, for believing in boundaries. She chuckled. You made them work, Bob. You turned them into grace. As evening settled in, Ethan locked up, Sophie proudly holding her new sign for everyone to admire. The workshop glowed in the soft orange light, sawdust floating like tiny sparks in the air. For a long moment, Bob just sat there, watching the life unfolding around him. The laughter, the movement, the future being shaped right in front of him. The peace in his chest was steady, rhythmic, like the slow, even beat of a heart finally at rest. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine through the open door. The world felt unhurried now, and for Bob Ellison, that was the truest miracle of all. To see love rebuilt not through words or wealth, but through work. Quiet, enduring work, the kind that lasts. The church hall glowed that night. String lights stretched from beam to beam, folding chairs lined in neat rows, and the air filled with the smell of coffee and warm casseroles. The town's annual community builders banquet had always been a simple affair, but this year it felt different. Maybe because, for once, everyone knew who the night was really about. Bob Ellison sat near the back at first, uncomfortable under the attention. He was dressed neatly in a pressed shirt and his best pair of boots, the ones Claire used to make him wear to weddings. Martha had saved him a seat beside her, whispering, "Don't even think about sneaking out early." "I wasn't planning to," he said, though his hand fidgeted with the brim of his hat. On the stage, the mayor adjusted the microphone, clearing his throat. "Tonight," he began, "we're recognizing a man who has done more for this town than he'll ever admit. A man whose hands have built half the homes on Main Street, and whose heart has built something far more lasting." Bob lowered his eyes. Compliments never sat easy on him. The mayor continued. "The Ellison and Son workshop has become a symbol for what community can look like. Not just craftsmanship, but compassion in motion. And it started with the man we're honoring tonight." A murmur of applause rippled through the crowd. Bob shifted in his chair, ready to stand, but the mayor smiled. "Before we bring him up, we have someone who'd like to say a few words." Ethan rose from his seat near the front. He looked different than the man Bob had spent years arguing with. Calmer, grounded, his confidence no longer sharp-edged, but warm, steady. As he took the microphone, he scanned the room until his gaze met his father's. "Most of you know my dad," he began, voice clear but gentle. "You've probably worked with him, or at least driven past one of his projects. For years, people called him the guy who could fix anything. Leaky roof, broken floor, jammed door. And that was true. He could fix anything." A small laugh rolled through the crowd. Ethan smiled, glancing at Bob. "But what most of you don't know is that for a long time, he was fixing everything except himself. And, I'll be honest, I didn't make it easy for him." The room fell quiet, the kind of stillness that carries weight. "I spent years trying to live up to him," Ethan went on, "and when I couldn't, I pulled away. But my father—" He paused, his voice catching. "He never stopped showing up, even when it hurt, even when I didn't deserve it." Bob swallowed hard, his vision blurring slightly. Ethan looked down at the speech in his hand, then set it aside. "I had something written, but it doesn't say what I really mean. My dad didn't just build homes. He rebuilt hearts, mine most of all." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling until it filled the entire hall. Bob felt his throat close as Ethan motioned for him to come forward. Martha nudged him. "Go on, Bob. You earned this one." As he walked up the steps to the stage, The applause grew louder, a wave of sound carrying years of memory with it. When he reached Ethan, his son handed him a small plaque, oak-framed, simple, engraved with the words Robert Ellison, builder, mentor, father. Bob looked down at it, then out at the crowd. He cleared his throat, gripping the sides of the podium. "I'm not a man of speeches," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I'll say this much. For a long time, I thought fixing things was my job, that every broken board, every bad decision could be repaired if I just worked hard enough." He paused, meeting Ethan's gaze. "But somewhere along the way, I learned that some things don't need fixing. They need listening. They need time. They need love." The crowd was silent, that reverent kind of silence that holds applause in its hands, waiting. He smiled faintly. "All I did was learn to stop fixing and start listening. The rest, well, the rest took care of itself." The applause came like thunder this time, echoing against the wooden beams. Ethan stepped forward, eyes wet, and pulled his father into an embrace. It wasn't just a hug, it was years of distance closing in one motion. The audience rose to their feet, some clapping, some wiping their own tears. Martha clapped the hardest, whispering to the woman next to her, "That's Grace, right there. That's what it looks like." As the crowd began to settle and music swelled softly in the background, Ethan leaned close to his father and said, "You know, Mom would have loved this moment." Bob smiled through the tears gathering in his eyes. "She's here, son. Always has been." The lights above the stage shimmered, catching the gold lettering on the plaque. Cameras flashed. Applause echoed once more, not for the builder who fixed things, but for the man who finally learned how to be whole. The morning light poured softly through the workshop windows, catching the dust in golden streams. It was quiet, except for the faint ticking of a wall clock and the low hum of distant traffic. Bob sat on his stool near the workbench, his hands resting on something wrapped in an old piece of flannel, the same cloth he used to clean his tools with back when his hands were steadier. Ethan walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're here early," he said, setting 1 cup beside his father. Bob smiled faintly. "Old habits. You get used to starting the day with the sound of wood and nothing else." Ethan leaned against the bench. "You thinking about taking on another project?" Bob shook his head slowly. "No. I'm thinking about handing one over." He nodded to the flannel bundle on the bench. Ethan frowned, curious, then unfolded it. Inside was an old leather tool belt, worn, scratched, the edges softened by time and use. The metal buckle was dull, the pocket stained with sawdust that had never quite washed out. Ethan stared at it for a long moment. "Dad, this is your belt." Bob nodded. "It's seen better years, but it's held more stories than any piece of leather has a right to." He ran his fingers over one of the deep creases. "Built 3 houses wearing this, fixed a dozen more, probably made 1,000 mistakes in it too." Ethan smiled softly, brushing his hand across the belt's worn surface. "You really want me to have it?" Bob looked him in the eye. "Yeah, but not to use, to remember." Ethan raised an eyebrow, grinning. "I'll use it anyway." That laugh, that shared warmth, filled the room, bouncing off the old wooden walls. For years, this space had carried echoes of tension, of silence. Now it carried only ease. Bob chuckled. "You always did do things your own way." "Guess I learned from the best," Ethan said. They stood together in the stillness for a while. No words needed. Bob could feel time moving differently now, slower, kinder. The world no longer pressed down like it once had. It simply was, and that was enough. On the back wall of the workshop hung an empty space above the main bench, the one where Claire's photo had always belonged. Ethan noticed it, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I thought maybe we could fix that today," he said, pulling out a framed picture. It was an old photo, Claire standing between them, her hands on their shoulders, all 3 laughing. The edges were slightly faded, but her smile hadn't lost its light. Bob took it carefully, his thumb tracing her face. "She'd like seeing us both in here again," he said softly. "Then let's make sure she's got the best spot," Ethan replied. Together, they hung the photo above the bench. When they stepped back, the sunlight hit it perfectly, warming the glass until it glowed. For a long moment, they didn't speak. The workshop hummed around them, tools hanging neatly on their hooks, the scent of sawdust lingering in the air. It was as if every project, every argument, every hard-won moment of understanding had left a piece of itself here. Ethan broke the silence first. "You know, when I was younger, I used to think all this was just about building things. Boards, nails, plans." Bob nodded. "That's what I thought too, for most of my life." He looked around slowly. Turns out the real work was building us. Ethan smiled, slipping the tool belt around his waist. "Guess we finally finished the hardest job." Bob chuckled, voice thick with emotion. "Maybe, or maybe we just learned how to work together." As the days stretched on, the workshop came alive, saws buzzing, hammers tapping, laughter blending with the hum of labor. The photo of Claire watched over them both, a silent witness to what they'd built and rebuilt. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled through the windows, gilding every surface with gold. Time, once sharp and unforgiving, had softened, becoming something almost gentle. And in that small, steady rhythm of creation and memory, Bob realized that legacies weren't passed through money or monuments, but through hands, stories, and the quiet gift of knowing when to let go. The morning was still, the kind of quiet that only winter could bring. Outside, snow fell slow and steady, blanketing the yard in a clean, white hush. Inside the workshop, the small space glowed faintly in the pale light filtering through the window. Bob sat at his old desk, a cup of tea cooling beside him, a single sheet of paper before him. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of what he was about to write. This wasn't a goodbye, not really. It was more like leaving a light on, just in case. He picked up the pen, the one Claire had given him on their 25th anniversary, its brass tip worn smooth from years of use. For a long moment, he simply looked at the page. Then, with a steady breath, he began. "To my family, if you're reading this, it means time has done what it always does. It's moved on. I don't want this to be a sad letter. I want it to be a reminder, a simple one. If you ever doubt love, look at what we built." He paused, the words sitting heavy but right. He could almost hear Claire's voice beside him, soft and approving. "That's a good start, Bob. Keep going." We didn't build it out of money or perfect choices. We built it from mistakes, from long silences, and stubborn hearts that finally learned how to listen. Every nail, every scar, every repaired piece of wood in this shop, it's proof that even broken things can hold strong if you care enough to mend them. He stopped again, letting the silence breathe. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the rhythm of his thoughts. Outside, the wind brushed against the house, whispering through the eaves. "Ethan, I was hard on you. Too hard, maybe. I thought being a father meant always leading, always knowing better. But truth is, I learned more from watching you grow than you ever learned from me. You taught me that love isn't about control. It's about trust. You gave me back my peace, son. I hope you carry yours forward without the weight I once did." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he continued. "Lily, thank you for keeping this family's spine straight when both of us men were too proud to bend. You loved Ethan through the storm, and you welcomed me back with grace I didn't deserve. You're the strength that holds it all together." He hesitated, pen hovering just above the paper. Then he wrote the last name slowly, reverently. "Sophie. By the time you read this, you'll be grown. Maybe you'll have your own family, your own dreams. Just remember, what you build matters, but how you build it matters more. Put care in your hands and kindness in your heart, and nothing you make will ever fall apart." He leaned back in his chair, reading the letter once, twice. Then he added one final line, simple and certain. "I loved this life, every crooked, beautiful bit of it, and I loved all of you even more. Dad and Grandpa, always." He set the pen down, folded the letter carefully, and slipped it into the wooden box, the same one he'd once given Ethan with the education fund for Sophie. The box still bore the carved initials B+E, smooth from years of handling. As he placed the lid on top, a soft creak filled the air. He smiled at the sound. Familiar, comforting. Rising slowly, he carried the box to the workbench and set it beneath the photo of Claire. The morning light had shifted now, breaking through the clouds in thin golden streaks. He opened the workshop door, letting the sunlight spill across the floor, warm against the cool wood. The air that drifted in carried the faint scent of snow and pine. He stood there for a while, breathing it in, his heart steady and unhurried. Behind him, the letter rested quietly in its box. Not a goodbye, but a testament. A life measured not by what he'd built, but by what he'd finally learned to let stand on its own. Snow began to drift gently across the open sill, catching the light like falling glass. Bob didn't move to close the door. Some things, he'd learned, were meant to stay open. The church bells rang softly that morning, their echoes drifting through the crisp December air. Snow fell slow and silent, like the world was remembering how to breathe. Inside the small-town chapel, the pews were full. Families bundled in coats, the smell of pine and wax candles hanging thick in the air. Ethan stood at the front, his hands gripping the wooden podium. The sanctuary glowed in warm light, the same golden hue that used to pour through his father's workshop windows. Behind him, the church's Christmas tree stretched high toward the rafters, its branches adorned with handmade ornaments, each one carved, painted, or built by hands that had learned what love really meant. He looked out across the congregation, familiar faces, kind eyes, and exhaled slowly before speaking. 1 year ago, he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I sat right over there in that third pew and thought I'd never fill the shoes my father left behind." A soft rustle moved through the room. "He wasn't a preacher," Ethan continued. "He wasn't a man of grand speeches or big gestures. He was a builder, of houses, of furniture, of people. And like most builders, he left his lessons behind in things that outlast him." He paused, glancing up at the light filtering through the stained glass window, morning sun breaking through a winter sky. "Dad used to say that boundaries were love-wearing armor. I didn't understand that for a long time. I thought love was supposed to give without limit, forgive without pause, fix without question. But he taught me that love isn't about saving people. It's about standing beside them, even when you can't carry their weight." His words lingered in the still air. Somewhere in the back row, Martha nodded quietly, tears catching in the corner of her eyes. Ethan smiled faintly. "He didn't preach that lesson. He lived it. He taught me that stepping back isn't the same as stepping away, and that sometimes letting go is the most faithful kind of love there is." He looked down at his notes, but didn't read them. His voice grew softer, almost reverent. "We all have someone who built us, someone who showed us what patience looks like, what forgiveness sounds like. For me, that was my dad. For this whole town, maybe, it was too." The small crowd murmured in agreement, the kind of shared understanding that didn't need words. A soft melody began from the piano, slow and familiar. Silent Night. Ethan let the notes fill the quiet, then gestured toward the front row where Lily and Sophie sat. "Before we end, my daughter has something she wants to share with you all." Sophie stood, her hands holding a folded piece of paper. The church seemed to lean in as she stepped to the microphone, her voice clear and gentle, carrying traces of both her father and her grandfather. "This is a letter from my grandpa," she said, unfolding the page. "He wrote it before he passed. Dad says it's the kind of thing you don't keep hidden." Her eyes moved across the words, and the room fell utterly still. "If you ever doubt love, look at what we built." A few quiet tears fell across the pews as Sophie continued. "We didn't build it from perfection. We built it from mistakes, forgiveness, and a whole lot of learning. And that's what makes it strong." Her small voice wavered, then steadied again. "Love is the work that never ends, so don't stop building." When she finished, she looked up, cheeks flushed, eyes shining. "He also said something else," she added, glancing toward her father. "He said, 'We were expecting you, always.'" For a moment, no one breathed. Then a soft sob broke the silence, not of sorrow, but of release. Lily reached for Ethan's hand, squeezing tightly. Martha dabbed at her eyes, whispering something to the woman beside her. "He would have been proud." Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that holds both grief and gratitude. "He's here," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "He's always here." As the service closed, the piano shifted into a brighter tune, one that carried the faint hum of hope. People began to rise, shaking hands, hugging, laughing softly. Outside the church, the snow was still falling, thick now, but gentle, blanketing the steps and streets in silver-white peace. Ethan stepped out last, holding Sophie's hand. Together they looked up as the bell in the steeple chimed noon, each note deep and full, ringing through the cold air. Inside, the tree lights flickered once more, reflecting off the polished wood of the pews, off the photo of Bob placed beside the altar, his smile frozen mid-laughter, as if he'd just told one of his dry, perfect jokes. The camera of life lingered there, on the light through the window, on the dust of snow floating in the air, on the faces turned upward in quiet joy. Ethan's voice came softly, as if carried on the wind itself. He built homes and rebuilt hearts, and in the end, that was enough. The bell tolled its final note. Outside, the snow kept falling, endless, soft, and forgiving, as light spilled through the chapel windows, bathing everything in gold. Forgiveness, at last, fulfilled.